The Pacific Northwest forests hold secrets that will keep you awake tonight. 11 terrifying tales from the darkest corners of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Where hikers vanish without explanation, where time stops moving forward, and where something ancient still hunts between the trees. If you've ever felt watched while walking through the woods, you were right. This is Verified Fears, and what you're about to hear will change how you see every forest forever. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because once you start listening, you won't want to miss what happens next. Let's step into the shadows. I'd hiked sections of Oregon's Mount Hood National Forest a dozen times before, always during summer when the trails were crowded with families and the parking lots overflowed with out-of-state plates. But October was different. The tourists had gone home. The vine maples blazed crimson against the Douglas firs, and I had the Timberline Trail almost entirely to myself. I started at the Paradise Park trailhead just after dawn, my breath fogging in the 40-degree air, planning a simple 12-mile loop that would put me back at my car before sunset. The forecast promised clear skies, and I'd packed light, just water, trail mix, and my phone with a fully charged battery. I'd done this route 3 times before. I knew every switchback, every creek crossing, every viewpoint where Hood's summit reflected perfectly in the alpine lakes. Or at least I thought I did. The first hour passed exactly as expected. I descended into Little Zigzag Canyon, crossed the wooden bridge over the glacial meltwater, and began the climb toward the ridgeline where the forest opened into meadows. My legs found their rhythm, my mind quieted, and for a while I forgot about the research deadlines waiting for me back in Portland, the lease renewal I hadn't signed, the text messages I'd been avoiding. This was why I came here. To disappear into something bigger than my small anxieties, to remember how insignificant I was against these ancient trees and volcanic slopes. But around mile 4, just as I entered a section of old-growth forest I didn't quite remember from previous hikes, I noticed the first carving. It was cut deep into the bark of a massive Douglas fir, maybe 6 feet off the ground. Just 4 numbers. 1987. The edges had weathered gray, and moss had begun filling the grooves. But someone had clearly taken time to carve those digits carefully, deliberately. I stopped, ran my fingers over the rough bark, and felt an odd chill that had nothing to do with the October air. Hikers carved things sometimes, initials, hearts, stupid declarations of love that would outlast the relationships by decades. But just a year. I pulled out my phone to check my location, and that's when I saw something that made my stomach tighten. According to my GPS, I was 2.3 miles west of where I should have been. Not off by a few dozen feet, which would make sense given tree cover and satellite drift, but by actual miles. I stared at the blue dot on my screen, watched it pulse in a location I'd never visited, on a section of trail that didn't appear on my downloaded map. I did what I'd been trained to do. I stopped moving, took 3 deep breaths, and tried to logic through the problem. GPS could be wrong. Satellites could glitch. Phone compasses went haywire near volcanic rock sometimes because of magnetic interference from all that iron-rich basalt. I'd just retrace my steps back to the bridge, reset from a known landmark, and laugh about this later over beers with friends who'd shake their heads at my poor navigation skills. But when I turned around, the trail looked different. Not dramatically different. The trees were the same species, the understory still thick with Oregon grape and sword ferns. But the light had changed somehow, filtering through the canopy at an angle that felt wrong for mid-morning in October. And there, carved into another trunk about 50 feet back the way I'd come, were more numbers. 1993. I started walking faster, my heartbeat loud in my ears, no longer caring about pace or conservation of energy. Every 100 feet or so, I found another carving. 1998, 2003, 2007, 2011, always just the year, always cut with the same careful precision, always positioned at exactly the same height on the largest tree in the immediate area. I wasn't on any trail anymore. I was certain of that now, but I couldn't find the point where I'd left it. The forest floor showed no sign of a maintained path, just the thick duff of decades of fallen needles and the occasional nurse log covered in resurrection ferns. I checked my watch. 10:47 a.m. I'd been hiking for just under 4 hours, which was right on schedule. But my phone's clock read 8:23 a.m., and the battery that had been fully charged when I started was down to 18%. That's when I heard the first whisper. It came from my left, from somewhere in the thick understory where salal bushes grew head high, and it sounded like my name. Not shouted, not called out the way you'd yell for a lost hiker, but whispered the way someone speaks when they're standing right behind you, their breath warm on your neck. "Sarah." I spun around, saw nothing but trees stretching in every direction, their trunks disappearing into the morning mist that shouldn't have been there because the forecast had promised clear skies. "Who's there?" I shouted. My voice sounded flat, dead, like the forest was swallowing the sound before it could travel. The whisper came again, from a different direction this time. "Sarah, why did you come back?" My throat went dry. I hadn't told anyone my name. I was hiking alone. There were no other cars in the Paradise Park lot when I started. I was certain of that. I'd specifically chosen this trail on a weekday in October because I wanted solitude. I found the next carving 20 feet ahead, 2016. And beneath it, scratched in smaller letters that looked fresher, less weathered, "Stayed too long." My hands were shaking now as I pulled up my GPS again, and the blue dot had moved even further west, deeper into a section of the Mount Hood wilderness that my map showed as blank space between marked trails. I'd been walking what I thought was east, back toward my starting point for the last 30 minutes. But somehow I'd traveled in the opposite direction. The whispers were coming from multiple points now, overlapping, some close and some distant, all saying different things in voices that sounded almost familiar, like recordings of people I might have known played at slightly wrong speeds. "Turn around, Sarah. You're walking in circles. Check your watch. How long have you been here?" 3 days. 3 days? 3 days. I looked at my watch again. 10:52 a.m. Only 5 minutes later than the last time I'd checked. But when I pulled up my phone, now at 7% battery despite not using it for anything except GPS, the clock read 8:23 a.m., the exact same time as before. I stood completely still, trying to control my breathing, trying to remember the survival training I'd taken before my first backpacking trip years ago. Stay calm. Stay put if you're lost. Make yourself visible. Wait for rescue. But I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I lived alone. My co-workers wouldn't expect me in the office until Monday, 3 days from now. My phone would die soon, and I had no way to call for help even if I had signal, which I didn't, which I hadn't had since entering this section of forest that I was now certain I'd never been in before. The next carving stopped me cold. 2024. Last year, and beneath it, carved in the same fresh style as the warning I'd seen before. "It knows your name." The whispers were constant now, a chorus of voices speaking over each other, some begging me to turn back, others laughing, others reciting what sounded like dates and times and GPS coordinates. I recognized one voice. It sounded like my college roommate, the one who'd moved to Seattle after graduation and who I hadn't spoken to in 6 years. "Sarah, I've been looking for you," the voice whispered from somewhere in the mist. "Sarah, how long have you been walking?" Another voice, this one sounding like my mother. "Honey, we've been worried. You didn't come home." But my mother was in Arizona, had been for a decade, and she'd never hiked a day in her life. I started running. I didn't care about direction anymore, didn't care about conserving energy or staying calm or any of the rational survival strategies I'd learned. I crashed through salal bushes, stumbled over hidden roots, splashed through a creek I didn't remember crossing before. The whispers followed, staying always just behind me, just out of sight, speaking in voices I almost recognized, telling me things about myself that no stranger should know. My middle name, my childhood address, the recurring nightmare I'd had as a kid about drowning in green water. And then I burst through a line of trees and found myself standing at the Paradise Park trailhead. My car sitting alone in the gravel lot exactly where I'd left it. And the sun was setting, painting the sky the deep orange of late afternoon. And my watch read 6:47 p.m. I fumbled for my keys with numb fingers, got in the car, locked the doors, and just sat there shaking while the last light drained from the sky. My phone was dead. When I plugged it into the car charger and it powered back on, the date read October 17th, 3 days after I'd started my hike. 3 days. The GPS history showed me walking in a perfect circle, over and over, covering the same half-mile loop at least 100 times. Though I could swear I'd been walking in straight lines, trying to escape, trying to find my way back. There were 17 missed calls from my boss, dozens of texts from co-workers asking where I was, 2 voicemails from the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office about a wellness check. And there, in my photo gallery, pictures I didn't remember taking, all time-stamped across the 3 days I'd apparently been gone, were images of trees with carvings I'd seen, each one in perfect focus, including one I hadn't photographed, hadn't even seen. A fresh carving on what looked like the biggest Douglas fir in the forest. The numbers cut deep in bleeding sap, 2025. I drove home and didn't look back. The next day I saw a news article about a hiker who'd gone missing in Mount Hood National Forest, recovered 2 days later with no memory of where he'd been, his phone showing the same impossible GPS loop. They found him at the Paradise Park trailhead at sunset, just sitting in his car, staring at nothing. I know what he was staring at. I know what he heard in those trees. And I know I'm never going back. Because last night I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of whispers coming from my bedroom window. And when I checked my phone's GPS, just for a second before I turned it off forever, the blue dot wasn't showing my apartment in Portland. It was showing Paradise Park, Mount Hood National Forest, in a grove of ancient trees where time doesn't move forward and something knows your name and keeps calling you back. If you've ever felt watched while hiking in Oregon, if you've ever heard whispers in the forest that sound almost like voices you know, don't stop to listen. Just keep walking. And whatever you do, don't look at your GPS, because you might not like what it tells you about where you really are or how long you've been there, walking in circles, while something in the trees learns everything about you and carves your name into bark that will outlast your memory. Subscribe to Verified Fears, because the forests remember, even when you forget. The research station sat 3 miles into Washington's Olympic National Forest, close enough to the Hoh rainforest boundary that moss grew on everything. The equipment shed, the solar panels, even the north-facing wall of my sleeping quarters. I'd been there for 6 weeks studying epiphytic moss species, documenting their role in capturing coastal fog moisture, boring work that paid graduate school stipends, and looked good on research grants. The nearest road was an hour's hike away, and I saw other people maybe twice a week when the park rangers did their rounds. Perfect conditions for someone who'd spent the last 3 years in crowded university labs and was hungry for silence. The forest gave me that in abundance, along with 12 feet of annual rainfall, trees the size of apartment buildings, and fog that rolled in from the Pacific every evening like clockwork, thick enough that I couldn't see my hand at arm's length. I'd grown used to the fog by week 3. It arrived around 6 p.m., settled over the valley like a living thing, and burned off by mid-morning when the temperature climbed above 50 degrees. The locals called it marine layer, a meteorological phenomenon caused by cold ocean currents meeting warmer inland air, completely natural and predictable. It made everything damp and turned the forest into something from a fairy tale. All those massive Sitka spruces and western hemlocks draped in club moss and licorice ferns disappearing into white nothingness. I'd walk the same trail every evening to check my sample plots, measuring moisture retention, photographing growth patterns, collecting specimens in labeled bags. The fog didn't bother me, at least not until the night I saw something moving in it that shouldn't have been there. It was a Thursday in late September, temperature dropping toward 40, and I was finishing my evening rounds about a quarter mile from the station. The fog had come in heavier than usual, so thick I was navigating by headlamp and GPS, following the same route I'd walked 50 times before. That's when I saw the silhouette. It was human-shaped, maybe 6 feet tall, standing perfectly still about 30 feet ahead on the trail. I called out, "Hello? You need help?" thinking it was a lost hiker who'd stayed out too late. But the figure didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there while the fog swirled around it in patterns that seemed wrong somehow. Flowing backward against the wind, I could feel pushing at my jacket. I took 3 steps closer, and the figure turned its head toward me, with a movement that was too smooth, too fluid, like it was rotating on an axis rather than turning like a person naturally would. Then it stepped sideways off the trail and disappeared into the fog. I should have gone back to the station right then. Every instinct I had was screaming that something was wrong, that whatever I'd just seen wasn't a hiker or a ranger or anything that belonged in these woods. But I'd spent 6 years in graduate programs learning to trust data over fear, to question emotional responses, to find rational explanations for anomalous observations. So I followed it. I stepped off the trail into the understory where the figure had vanished, playing my headlamp across the sword ferns and devil's club, looking for boot prints in the soft duff, for broken vegetation, for any sign of passage. What I found instead were more silhouettes, at least a dozen of them, standing in a rough circle about 20 feet apart, all facing inward toward the spot where I was standing. They didn't have faces that I could see, just dark shapes against slightly less dark fog. But I could feel them watching me with a tension that made my skin crawl. I backed away slowly, keeping my headlamp trained on the nearest figure, and it matched my movement step for step, maintaining the exact same distance between us. I ran. I crashed back through the undergrowth toward where I thought the trail should be. Branches whipping at my face, my boots catching on hidden roots, my breath coming in panicked gasps that I could hear echoing strangely in the fog-muffled silence. When I finally stumbled back onto the trail, the station lights were visible through the mist about 200 yards ahead. Warm yellow squares that meant safety and locked doors, and a radio I could use to call the ranger station. I sprinted the remaining distance, got inside, slammed the door, and threw the deadbolt. Then I sat on the floor with my back against the door for 20 minutes while my heart rate slowly returned to normal, and I tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing, that the isolation was getting to me, that I'd seen tree shadows and let my imagination fill in the rest. The next morning, the fog had burned off by 9 a.m. like always. And in the bright September sunshine, everything looked harmless. I hiked back to where I'd seen the figures and found nothing unusual, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no evidence anyone or anything had been standing there. I collected my moss samples, updated my field notes, and decided not to mention the incident in my weekly radio check with the university. But that evening, when the fog rolled in, I stayed inside. I watched through the station windows as the white wall advanced through the trees, swallowing them one by one, and I could swear I saw silhouettes moving in it again. Closer this time, maybe 50 feet from the building. I counted 7 of them, all standing perfectly motionless, all facing the station. When I turned off my interior lights to see better, they turned their heads in unison to track the darkness. The third night, they were 20 feet away. I could see more detail now. Or rather, I could see the absence of detail. They weren't shadows or tree shapes or tricks of the light. They were voids in the fog, human-shaped spaces where the mist wouldn't go, as if something invisible was displacing it just by existing. They didn't walk so much as glide, their movements perfectly silent. No footsteps crunching on the forest floor, no breathing, no sound at all, except for the wind moving through the upper canopy. I tried photographing them through the window, but every image came out as uniform gray, my camera unable to capture whatever my eyes were seeing. And then one of them reached up with what might have been an arm and knocked 3 times on the window, each impact sounding like knuckles on glass, even though nothing visible was touching the surface. I grabbed the emergency radio and called the ranger station, getting Dave on night duty, and tried to explain what was happening. He listened patiently while I described the figures in the fog, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice when he suggested I might be experiencing isolation fatigue, or possibly carbon monoxide exposure from my propane heater. He promised to hike out first thing in the morning to check my equipment and my mental state. Probably in that order. After we disconnected, I sat in the dark station watching the figures press closer, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The fog was coming inside. Not through any open door or window. Everything was sealed tight against the damp. But seeping through microscopic gaps around the window frames, through the ventilation grates, through spaces I couldn't even see. It was flowing upward against gravity, spreading across the ceiling like spilled milk in reverse, and bringing the figures with it. I ran to the equipment room and grabbed my emergency pack, 3 days of food, water purification tablets, first aid kit, the satellite beacon that would summon rescue services if I activated it. The fog was filling the station faster now, already knee-deep in the main room, cold and wet and wrong in ways that had nothing to do with normal weather patterns. I could see multiple figures inside with me, their void-shaped bodies moving through my workspace, reaching toward the samples I'd collected, the journals I'd written, the computer where I'd stored 6 weeks of research data. One of them turned toward me, and even though it had no face, I understood with absolute certainty that it was looking at me, studying me, learning from me the way I'd been learning from the moss and the trees and the ecosystem I'd come here to document. I smashed the window with a chair and climbed through, cutting my hands on the remaining glass, not caring about the equipment or the data or anything, except getting away from whatever was inside that station. The fog outside was impossibly thick, visibility maybe 3 feet. But I had my headlamp and my GPS and 6 weeks of trail familiarity. I started running toward the main road, following the route I'd memorized, and the figures followed. I could sense them in the fog behind me, beside me, ahead of me, always maintaining that careful distance, never quite catching up, but never falling behind either. My GPS showed I was moving in the right direction, but the distance to the road wasn't decreasing. I'd run for 20 minutes at near sprint speed and covered maybe 100 feet according to the satellite coordinates. That's when I found the journal. It was lying on the trail in front of me, its pages soaked through with moisture but still readable in my headlamp beam. The handwriting was different from mine. The dates were from 1987. But the content was identical to what I'd been writing for the past 6 weeks. The same observations about moss growth, the same sample plot locations, the same growing unease about shapes in the fog. The last entry was dated September 28, 1987, and it read, "They're not trying to catch me. They're trying to replace me. I've seen my own face in the fog, wearing my clothes, carrying my equipment. When I get out of here, if I get out, there will be 2 of us, and no one will know which one is real." I looked up from the journal and saw myself standing 10 feet away, perfect in every detail except for the eyes, which were hollow spaces where the fog showed through. I activated the emergency beacon. Somewhere overhead, satellites I couldn't see were receiving my distress signal and triangulating my position and alerting rescue services that someone was in trouble in the Olympic National Forest. The figure wearing my face tilted its head, mimicking my movement with a precision that was almost, but not quite perfect, like a video played back with the timing slightly off. More figures emerged from the fog, dozens of them now, each one wearing a different face, different clothes, different expressions of fear frozen in their void features. And I understood finally what they were. Everyone who'd stayed too long in the fog, everyone who'd let it study them enough to make a copy, everyone who'd run for the road and never made it because something else had walked out of the forest wearing their skin. Dave found me at dawn, 3 miles from the station, unconscious from hypothermia and blood loss from the cuts on my hands. He said I'd been talking in my sleep about fog walkers and replacements and journals from 1987, none of which made sense to him. He said I was lucky the beacon led them to me because the fog had been unusually thick, visibility near 0, and they'd almost walked right past my position. He said the station was fine, all my equipment intact, no sign of forced entry or fog damage or anything I described over the radio. But he didn't explain why my computer showed someone had been accessing my research files all night while I was unconscious in the woods, or why the security camera footage showed a figure that looked exactly like me walking out of the station at 6:47 a.m., right about when Dave was driving up the access road. I left the Olympic Peninsula the next day and haven't been back. I finished my degree using someone else's data, got a job at a lab in New Mexico where it's dry and fog is something that happens other places. Told everyone I'd decided field research wasn't for me. But sometimes, on humid mornings, when the bathroom mirror fogs over after a shower, I see something in the condensation that isn't my reflection, and I remember the empty faces in the Olympic fog. And I wonder which one of us walked out of those woods. Because here's what I never told the rangers, or the university, or anyone else who asked about that night. When they found me at dawn, my emergency pack was missing 3 days of food, my water bottles were empty, and my boots showed wear patterns consistent with hiking for 72 hours straight. Even though I'd only been gone since midnight. Check your mirrors in the fog. Make sure the face looking back is really yours. And if you ever find yourself in the Olympic rainforest after dark, when that marine layer rolls in thick from the Pacific, don't stop to study the shapes moving in the mist. They're studying you back, and they're learning fast. This is verified fears, and some things in the fog are looking for bodies to wear. I'd been a park ranger at Crater Lake National Park for 11 years, long enough to know the difference between genuine emergencies and tourist panic. So when 3 separate groups reported seeing trees that appeared to breathe along the rim trail near Watchman Lookout Station, I treated it like I treated most unusual sightings, with professional skepticism and a clipboard. People saw strange things at 7,000 feet elevation, especially visitors from sea level who weren't used to the thin air. Add in the disorienting deep blue of the lake itself, that impossible color that doesn't look real even when you're staring right at it, and you got a recipe for overactive imaginations. But procedure was procedure. So I logged the reports, grabbed my day pack, and headed out on patrol to investigate the section of trail where the breathing trees supposedly existed. It was early October, the tail end of tourist season before the snow closed the rim road for winter. The aspens were turning gold against the volcanic rock, and the lake sat perfectly still in its caldera, reflecting the sky like polished glass. I'd walked this trail maybe 300 times, knew every viewpoint, every interpretive sign, every spot where tourists stopped to take photos of Wizard Island rising from the water, like a miniature volcano inside the bigger volcano that had collapsed 7,000 years ago. The forest here wasn't dense. Mostly mountain hemlock and Shasta red fir scattered across the pumice soil that still showed evidence of Mount Mazama's catastrophic eruption. Nothing that should cause confusion or fear. But when I reached the spot where all three groups had reported the phenomenon, I stopped walking and just stood there for a full minute, watching the trees and trying to convince myself I wasn't seeing what I was definitely seeing. The bark was moving, not swaying with wind. There was no wind, but expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pattern that looked disturbingly like breathing. I approached the nearest hemlock, a mature specimen maybe 80 feet tall, and placed my palm flat against the trunk. The bark pushed outward against my hand, held for 3 seconds, then contracted, exactly like a chest rising and falling, with inhalation and exhalation. The cycle repeated every 8 seconds, perfectly regular, synchronized across at least a dozen trees I could see from my position. I pulled out my radio to call it in, then hesitated. What was I supposed to report? Trees appearing to breathe? I'd sound insane. Instead, I took out my phone and started filming, documenting the bark movement, the time, the location, the weather conditions. Everything by the book, even when the book didn't have a chapter for this particular situation. I spent 2 hours examining every tree in the area, measuring the expansion patterns with a fabric tape measure, noting which species showed the phenomenon and which didn't. Only the hemlocks and firs were breathing. The aspens and lodgepole pines remained normal. The pattern was consistent. 8-second cycles, expansion of approximately 1 inch at the thickest part of the trunk, perfectly synchronized between trees. No visible cause, no insects, no disease. No explanation that fit my forestry training or my decade of field experience. As I worked, I became aware of a low sound, barely audible, like air moving through a vast underground chamber. It seemed to come from the ground itself, rising up through the volcanic soil, through the root systems, through the trees. When the trees expanded, the sound peaked. When they contracted, it faded. They were breathing in unison with something beneath them. I should have left then and called in the science team from the USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory. This was clearly something geological, something related to the caldera system that created Crater Lake, when Mount Mazama collapsed during an eruption 40 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. But I'd been a ranger long enough to know that scientists took weeks to mobilize, and I'd lose credibility if this turned out to be some mundane explanation I'd missed. So I kept investigating, following the breathing trees along the rim trail, documenting how the pattern extended westward for nearly a quarter mile. Every breathing tree was rooted in soil that showed a particular composition, darker, richer, mixed with volcanic ash, that laboratory analysis would probably date to the climactic eruption 7,700 years ago, when something incomprehensibly massive had destroyed the mountain and reshaped the entire landscape. The sun was getting low, maybe an hour from setting, when I noticed the pattern in the bark itself. The breathing wasn't random. It was revealing something. During expansion, the natural fissures in the bark widened, creating shapes that almost looked deliberate. I watched one complete cycle, then another, and realized the shapes were forming letters, or something like letters, angular symbols that appeared during the expansion phase, then vanished when the bark contracted. I photographed them, trying to capture the moment when the breathing made them visible, and as I was reviewing the images, I felt the ground move beneath my feet. Not an earthquake, I'd felt those before, but a settling sensation, like the earth was exhaling, matching the rhythm of the trees. I pulled up the geological surveys on my phone, the reports about Mount Mazama and the Caldera Formation, the seismic monitoring data that the USGS maintained for all Cascade volcanoes. Crater Lake sat atop an active magma chamber, though the last eruption had been those minor events that formed Wizard Island maybe 5,000 years ago. But the monitoring equipment showed no unusual activity, no increased seismicity, no ground deformation, no changes in the hydrothermal system. According to every scientific instrument we had, Mount Mazama was sleeping peacefully. Yet the trees were breathing with a pattern that matched the depth of the caldera itself. 8 seconds, the same amount of time it would take sound to travel down to the caldera floor and back up again, bouncing off something that was listening. That's when I made my mistake. I touched one of the symbols during the expansion phase, traced my finger along the angular pattern in the bark, and the breathing stopped. Every tree within visual range froze mid-expansion, locked in the inhale position, and the underground sound I'd been hearing cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. I stood frozen, my fingers still pressed against the bark, and felt something shift in the quality of the air around me. The light changed, taking on a reddish tint that had nothing to do with the sunset. And when I looked toward Crater Lake, the water was no longer its famous deep blue. It was glowing, very faintly, with a bioluminescence that came from far below the surface, from depths that exceeded the official measurement of 1,949 feet. From chambers the geological surveys didn't know existed because they'd never mapped the connection between the caldera floor and what lay beneath it in the magma chamber that wasn't quite as dormant as the instruments indicated. The trees exhaled all at once, a massive synchronized contraction that sent the symbols receding back into the bark. And I heard voices, not in my ears but deeper, resonating through my bones, through the volcanic rock beneath my feet, through the interconnected root systems of every breathing tree on the rim. They were speaking in rhythms that matched the caldera depth, in patterns that echoed the eruption cycle of Mount Mazama, in a language made of geological time scales that humans weren't meant to comprehend. I understood one message with absolute clarity. Something beneath Crater Lake was waking up, and it had been using the trees to breathe while it slept, and I'd just interrupted its 7,000-year rest cycle by touching the symbols that controlled the connection between surface and depth. I ran. I abandoned all my training about staying calm and documenting observations and following procedure. I sprinted back along the rim trail toward the ranger station, my boots sliding on loose pumice, my breath coming in gasps that mirrored the 8-second cycle of the trees. Behind me, I could hear more trees joining the breathing pattern. Not just hemlocks and firs, but every species, even the dead snags, even the stumps, all of them expanding and contracting in perfect synchronization. The underground sound was louder now, no longer subtle, a resonance that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I looked back once and saw the trees bending inward, all of them leaning toward the caldera rim, toward the lake, like they were being pulled by something with gravitational force stronger than Earth's rotation. When I reached the ranger station, my supervisor was dealing with a new flood of reports. Visitors at Rim Village had felt tremors. The water in Crater Lake was moving in spiral patterns despite no wind. The USGS monitoring station was detecting seismic signatures that didn't match any known volcanic event. Rhythmic pulses at 8-second intervals, emanating from a source deeper than the magma chamber, from a depth that shouldn't have existed in the Cascade volcanic arc. I tried to explain about the breathing trees and the symbols and the voices in the geological substrate, but I couldn't make it sound rational. All I could say was that something beneath the caldera was conscious, and it had been sleeping since Mount Mazama collapsed. And the trees were its respiratory system, breathing air from the surface down to the depths. And I'd woken it by touching the control symbols carved into living bark. They evacuated the park that night. 5,000 tourists and staff, all guided down the access road in the dark, while the breathing patterns spread through every forest within 10 miles of the caldera rim. The USGS dispatched emergency teams, brought in equipment to measure the phenomenon, tried to find rational explanations for why mature trees were showing lung-like behavior synchronized with a seismic rhythm from impossible depths. They never found an explanation I heard about. Though I stopped working for the Park Service a week later and moved to Colorado, where the geology is old and stable and nothing breathes beneath your feet. But I follow the monitoring reports obsessively, watching the seismic data from Crater Lake, counting the intervals between the rhythmic pulses that haven't stopped since that October evening. Here's what keeps me awake. The 8-second breathing cycle is getting faster. When I first measured it, each breath took 8 seconds exactly. Last month, according to the public USGS data, it had decreased to 7 seconds. The progression is steady, predictable, accelerating at a rate that suggests something is becoming more active, more awake, more ready to do whatever it's been waiting 7,000 years to do. I've calculated the timeline based on the acceleration curve, and if the pattern continues, the breathing will hit 1-second intervals sometime in the next 3 years. And then what? Another eruption 40 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. A caldera-forming event that will reshape the entire Pacific Northwest? Or something worse. Something that doesn't fit our geological models because it isn't purely geological. Something that's been using volcanic activity as a cover for its own existence since long before humans evolved to wonder what makes mountains breathe. If you visit Crater Lake, if you walk those rim trails and stare down into that impossibly blue water and feel the ground pulse beneath your feet in a rhythm that matches breathing, remember this. The trees are listening. They're connected to something that stretches down past the lake bottom, past the volcanic rock, past the magma chamber, into depths where consciousness takes forms we don't have names for. Don't touch the bark when it expands. Don't trace the symbols that appear in the fissures. And if you hear voices speaking in rhythms measured in centuries, in patterns that echo eruption cycles and continental drift, don't stop to translate them. Just leave, and don't look back at the water. Because you might see what's looking up from the depths, counting down the seconds until it breathes its last underground breath and starts breathing our air instead. This is verified fears, and some mountains aren't sleeping. They're just breathing very, very slowly. October in Washington's Gifford-Pinchot National Forest meant one thing for wildlife photographers: elk rut. I'd been tracking a particular Roosevelt bull for 3 days. a massive specimen with a 6-point rack that would make an incredible portfolio piece. The weather was perfect for it. Cold enough that my breath fogged, but not so cold that my fingers went numb on the camera controls. I'd hiked 8 miles into the backcountry, far beyond where casual hikers ventured, into terrain where the old-growth Douglas firs grew thick enough to block satellite signals, and the undergrowth was chest-high with sword ferns and vine maples gone crimson with autumn. The bull had been bugling every morning from a ridge above a small creek drainage, his calls echoing through the valley with that distinctive, high-pitched scream that sounded almost supernatural in the pre-dawn darkness. I'd set up my position before sunrise, downwind from where I expected him to appear. Camera mounted on a tripod with the telephoto lens that cost more than my car. The forest was alive with sound. Ravens calling from the canopy, Douglas squirrels chattering warnings about my presence, the creek babbling over volcanic rocks 50 feet below my position, wind moving through the upper branches with that distinctive sigh of mature conifers. I'd learned to love these sounds during my 5 years of wildlife photography. The constant audio backdrop that told you the forest was healthy and functioning, and you were just another temporary visitor passing through without causing alarm. When you heard normal forest sounds, you knew the animals weren't spooked, weren't hiding, weren't aware of you as a threat. Silence in the woods usually meant predators, meant something had gone wrong, meant it was time to be alert. The bull appeared right on schedule, emerging from a stand of hemlocks about 200 yards upslope. His breath steaming in the cold air, his antlers catching the first rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy. I started shooting immediately, the camera shutter clicking in rapid sequence, capturing him as he scraped his antlers against a sapling, marking territory, showing dominance, doing all the things bulls do during rut when they're competing for cows and establishing breeding rights. He bugled once, that incredible sound that somehow combined a whistle with a roar. And I smiled because I was getting exactly the shots I'd hiked 8 miles to capture. Professional-grade wildlife photography in natural settings, the kind of work that magazines paid premium rates for, the kind of images that built careers. Then the sound stopped. Not gradually, not fading away as the forest settled into quiet. They just ended, like someone had flipped a switch or dropped a soundproof curtain over my section of the woods. The creek stopped babbling. The wind stopped moving through the trees. The ravens went silent mid-call. Even my camera shutter, which I could still feel clicking under my finger, made no sound whatsoever. I lifted my head from the viewfinder and looked around, and the elk was gone. Not fled, not crashed away through the undergrowth the way spooked animals do, just gone between one heartbeat and the next, vanished from the clearing like he'd never been there. I stood slowly, every instinct screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. I snapped my fingers next to my ear, nothing, clapped my hands, nothing, shouted, nothing. Not even the sensation of air moving past my vocal cords, like the sound was being absorbed before it could form. The silence wasn't just absence of noise, it was presence of nothing. A void that swallowed every vibration, every acoustic wave, every compression of air molecules that should have created sound. I could feel my boots on the forest floor but couldn't hear my footsteps. Could see the creek moving over rocks, but couldn't hear the water. Could watch a raven's beak opening and closing in the tree above me, but couldn't hear its call. The silence had a physical quality, a pressure against my eardrums, a weight that made me dizzy and nauseous. I grabbed my pack and started moving down slope toward the trail, toward my truck parked 8 miles away at the trailhead, toward civilization and normal sounds and explanations that made sense. My compass showed the right direction, southwest, following the drainage, hitting the main trail in about 2 miles if I moved fast. But as I walked, I noticed the silence was moving with me. No, not with me. It was following me, staying always about 50 feet behind, a bubble of absolute quiet that traveled through the forest like a wave. I could see the boundary. Birds would be calling normally in the trees ahead of me, and then I'd pass through their area and their sounds would cut off, swallowed by whatever was creating this acoustic dead zone. And the zone was growing. When I first noticed it, the silence extended maybe 50 feet in all directions. After 10 minutes of hiking, it had expanded to 75 feet. After 20 minutes, over 100 feet. I started running. My lungs burned and my pack bounced painfully against my spine, and branches whipped at my face. But I couldn't hear any of it. Not my breathing, not my heartbeat, not the sound of undergrowth breaking under my boots. It was like running in a nightmare where you scream, but nothing comes out. Where you know something is chasing you, but you can't hear it approaching. I looked back once and saw what I could only describe as a distortion in the air, like heat shimmer, but cold, moving through the forest behind me at exactly my pace. When I stopped to catch my breath, it stopped. When I started running again, it followed. And the silence kept expanding, now reaching maybe 150 feet in all directions, killing every sound, turning the living forest into a sensory deprivation chamber. My equipment started malfunctioning. My phone showed no signal, expected this deep in the backcountry. But the GPS function died completely, the screen flickering and going dark, despite a full battery. My watch stopped, the second hand frozen at 47 seconds past whatever minute it had been when the silence first hit. The camera in my pack was dead, wouldn't even power on, like the silence was disrupting electronics along with sound. I pulled out my backup compass, old-school liquid-filled model that didn't need batteries, and watched the needle spin uselessly, unable to find magnetic north. Like whatever was creating the silence was interfering with the Earth's magnetic field or my perception of it. I'd been running for maybe 40 minutes, had covered possibly 3 miles of rough terrain when I saw the first body. It was a black-tailed deer, a young buck lying on its side in a patch of salal. No visible injuries, no blood, no sign of predation. Its eyes were open, and its mouth was stretched in what looked like a scream. But there was no sound. Had never been any sound when it died. I didn't stop to examine it more closely because I could see others now. More deer, a coyote, 3 ravens that had fallen from the sky and lay crumpled on the forest floor, all arranged in a rough line that marked the boundary where the silence had passed through earlier before it started following me. They'd all died instantly when the quiet reached them, killed by the absence of sound itself or by whatever was using the silence to hunt. That's when I understood I wasn't going to outrun it. The silence was faster when I ran, matching my pace exactly, never falling behind, never catching up, maintaining that precise distance like a predator pacing prey, wearing it down, waiting for exhaustion. I stopped running and turned to face it. The distortion in the air was clearer now. Maybe because the silence had grown so large, maybe because I was too tired to run anymore, and my perception was sharpening in the way it does when you accept you're going to die. It looked almost like a lens, bending light around itself, and through it I could see the forest behind it still had sound. I could see birds moving their beaks, see branches swaying in wind I couldn't hear, see all the normal life of the woods happening on the other side of this expanding zone of nothing. I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled out my emergency whistle, the one rangers recommend for bear encounters. The one that supposedly makes a sound so loud and piercing that it scares off most predators. I blew it with every bit of air in my lungs. The silence swallowed it completely. I felt the air rushing out, but heard nothing, not even the sensation of sound inside my own skull. But the distortion stopped moving. It held position about 30 feet away, and I could feel attention focusing on me, could sense intelligence behind the quiet, something examining me with interest that felt hungry and patient and completely inhuman. The silence contracted suddenly, pulling inward from the 150-foot radius to maybe 50 feet, compressing, concentrating, and I realized it was preparing to do something, to finish whatever it had been doing to the deer and the coyote and the birds. I ran again. Pure panic now, no strategy, just animal flight response. I crashed through undergrowth without any sense of direction. Couldn't hear myself moving, but could feel branches tearing at my clothes and skin, could feel my boots sliding on loose duff and volcanic soil. I broke through a line of trees, and suddenly I could hear again. My own gasping breath, my heartbeat hammering, the sounds of the forest alive and normal. I'd somehow crossed out of the silence zone, outrun it or escaped it, or it had let me go. I didn't stop to analyze which one. I kept running until I hit the main trail, followed it southwest for another hour until I saw my truck, got inside and locked the doors, and sat there shaking while normal sounds filtered through the windows. Wind, birds, distant traffic on the forest road. That night, I checked the photos from my camera before the silence killed it. The early shots of the elk were perfect, exactly what I'd hoped to capture. But the last few frames, taken automatically in burst mode after I'd lifted my head from the viewfinder, showed something behind the bull. A distortion in the air, a space where the trees looked wrong, bent, like light was avoiding that area. The elk was staring directly at it in the final frame, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a bugle I never heard. The timestamp showed I'd taken 57 photos after that, but they were all completely black, like the camera had been running in total darkness, even though I knew it had been morning in bright sunlight. I called the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest Ranger Station the next day and reported what I'd found, the dead animals, the coordinates of the area, the strange phenomenon. They promised to send someone to investigate, thanked me for the report. And I could hear in their voices they thought I'd experienced altitude sickness or dehydration or panic. 3 days later, they called back. They'd found the deer and the coyote and the birds, all dead with no visible cause, all arranged in that line marking where something had passed through. They'd also found something else, a hiker's backpack and boots and clothes, all laid out neatly on the trail. But no body. The hiker's name was on their permit. They'd entered the backcountry 2 days before I did. They'd been hiking in the same drainage where I'd photographed the elk. Sometimes now, when I'm in crowded places, restaurants or malls or city streets, I'll notice a subtle change in the ambient noise, a slight dampening, a reduction in the constant background hum of human activity. It never lasts more than a few seconds, and most people don't seem to notice. But I notice. And I remember that morning in Gifford-Pinchot, when the forest went silent and something moved through the quiet like a shark through water, hunting with absence instead of presence, killing with the removal of sound instead of violence. I don't do wildlife photography anymore. I stay in cities where there's always noise, always traffic, always voices and music and construction sounds, where silence never gets the chance to settle and grow, and remember it's hungry. If you're ever hiking in the Cascades and you notice the forest sounds fading, if the birds stop calling and the wind stops moving and you can't hear your own footsteps, don't stop to investigate. Don't try to understand it. Just run toward the loudest noise you can find, toward people and civilization and anywhere there's enough sound to fill the spaces where silence learns to hunt. My sister Emma died on a Tuesday in March, which seemed wrong because Tuesdays were supposed to be unremarkable, the kind of day that passes without notice between Monday's obligations and Wednesday's midweek momentum. But Emma had always done things at unexpected times, quitting her corporate job to become a massage therapist, adopting a senior cat when everyone told her to get a kitten, asking me to scatter her ashes in Oregon's Willamette National Forest, even though she'd only visited once, 7 years ago, during a trip we took together after our mother's funeral. She left specific instructions in her will: the Opal Creek wilderness area, somewhere near the old-growth Douglas firs, on a day when it was raining because she'd loved the sound of rain in forests. As a grief counselor, I'd helped dozens of clients navigate loss, had all the professional frameworks for processing death, understood the stages and the timelines and the healthy versus unhealthy coping mechanisms. None of it prepared me for carrying my younger sister in a wooden box small enough to fit in my backpack. I chose October for the hike because the Pacific Northwest rain returns reliably by then, and because I'd taken 3 months off work after Emma's death and needed to finish this final task before I could even think about returning to my practice. The Opal Creek trailhead was nearly empty on a Thursday morning. Just my car and one other vehicle, which was perfect because I wanted to do this alone. Wanted to speak to Emma without strangers wondering why a woman in her 40s was crying and talking to a box. The trail followed along Opal Creek itself for the first mile, the water running clear over volcanic rocks, and then climbed gradually into the old growth section where the Douglas firs were supposedly 1,000 years old, their trunks so massive you'd need 4 people holding hands to encircle them. The rain started as I entered the ancient forest, exactly as Emma had wanted, soft and steady, the kind of rain that feels like permission to be sad. I'd walked maybe 2 miles when I heard her voice, not metaphorically, not in my head the way grief sometimes makes you imagine conversations with the dead. I heard Emma's actual voice, coming from somewhere in the trees to my left, speaking words I recognized immediately because I'd heard them before. "I don't think this is the right trail," she was saying, her tone uncertain, the way she sounded when she was trying to navigate without admitting she was lost. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still in the rain, listening, my heart doing something complicated in my chest that felt like hope and horror mixed together. The voice came again, clearer now. "Sarah, we should go back. I don't recognize any of this." It was from our trip 7 years ago, the afternoon we'd gotten turned around trying to find the waterfall Emma had read about online. We'd argued about it. I'd wanted to keep going. Emma had wanted to retreat to the marked trail. We'd eventually found our way, laughed about it later over dinner, turned it into a story about sisterly stubbornness. I walked toward the voice, leaving the trail, pushing through sword ferns and Oregon grape that soaked my pants with rain and dew. The voice grew louder, more distinct, and I could hear my own voice now too, younger, more impatient. "We're fine, Emma. Stop worrying." It was coming from a massive Douglas fir, maybe 15 feet in diameter, its bark deeply furrowed with age. I approached it slowly, reached out to touch the rough surface, and felt vibration under my palm. Not quite sound, more like echo, like something resonating through the wood itself. The bark was marked with patterns that looked almost like waveforms, like someone had carved audio representations into the living wood. When I pressed my ear against the trunk, I could hear the entire argument playing on loop. Emma worried, me dismissive, both of us eventually laughing. The conversation ending as we found the trail marker that proved Emma had been right about going back. I moved to the next tree, and it held a different memory. Our mother's funeral, Emma's voice cracking as she read the eulogy she'd written, her words about love and loss and trying to be brave echoing through the wood like it had been recorded and stored there. Another tree held Emma at 16, calling me from college because she'd failed a chemistry exam and needed to hear that failure wasn't permanent. Another held Emma at 32, telling me she'd been diagnosed with the cancer that would kill her 3 years later, her voice steady and terrified and trying so hard to sound calm. The trees were storage, I realized. Not just for my memories of Emma, but for everyone who'd ever spoken or cried or died within range of their root systems. The old-growth Douglas firs with their 1,000-year lifespans had absorbed voices the way they absorbed rainfall and carbon dioxide, had trapped them in their bark and played them back in endless loops for anyone who stopped to listen. I should have left. Every professional instinct I had as a counselor was screaming that this was unhealthy, that hearing Emma's voice was interfering with my grief processing, that I needed to scatter her ashes and leave this forest and never come back. But I kept moving deeper into the old growth, pressing my ear against trunk after trunk, searching for more of my sister. I found her at 25, telling me about the massage therapy program she wanted to apply to. At 18, arguing with me about borrowing my car. At 7, crying because she'd lost her favorite stuffed animal. The trees held everything, chronologically scattered, each voice memory trapped in the specific tree that had been closest when the words were spoken. And then I found the tree I'd been dreading, the one I knew had to exist somewhere in this forest if the pattern held true. It was the largest Douglas fir I'd seen, standing slightly apart from the others in a small clearing where the rain fell straight down without interference from the canopy. The bark showed fresher patterns, more recent carvings in the waveform shapes. And when I pressed my hand against it, I felt stronger vibrations, more immediate echoes. I knew what I'd hear before I pressed my ear to the trunk, but I did it anyway, because grief makes you do things that hurt. Emma's voice came through clear and present, not from 7 years ago, but from 3 months ago, from the hospital room where I'd held her hand while the morphine failed to manage her pain. She was crying, begging someone. Me, I realized, to make it stop, saying words I'd tried to forget. Sarah, I'm scared. I don't want to die, please. I don't want to die. My own voice, broken and helpless. I know, baby. I know. I'm right here. And then Emma's breathing, shallow and rapid, and then slower, and then the silence that had ended her. I collapsed against the tree, sliding down until I was sitting in the wet duff at its base, and the memory kept playing on loop. Emma dying over and over. Her final hours compressed into 3 minutes of audio that repeated endlessly through the wood. She hadn't died in this forest. She died in Portland, 60 miles away, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and failure. But somehow the tree was playing it back anyway, like the memory was strong enough, traumatic enough, that it had reached across distance to imprint itself here in the place she'd wanted her ashes scattered. Or maybe I was the connection. Maybe I'd carried the memory with me so powerfully that the trees were reading it from me, pulling the audio from my grief and amplifying it back through their ancient wood. I opened the box containing Emma's ashes, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. I'd planned a speech, something meaningful about releasing her to the forest she'd loved, about cycles of life and death and decomposition feeding new growth. All the therapeutic frameworks I'd learned in graduate school, all the comforting narratives about natural processes and continuation of energy. But the words wouldn't come. Not while I could hear Emma begging not to die. Not while the tree was forcing me to relive the worst 3 hours of my life on continuous replay. I stood and threw the ashes at the base of the Douglas fir. Not gently like I'd intended, not with ceremony, just scattered them in anger and grief and desperate need to make the memory stop. The ashes settled into the forest floor, mixing with rain and duff and the root systems of the 1,000-year-old tree that held my sister's death. The voice stopped. The vibrations under my palm ceased. The waveform patterns in the bark went smooth and blank, like they'd been erased. I backed away from the tree, breathing hard, my vision blurred with rain and tears I couldn't separate. The silence in the forest felt wrong now, oppressive, like the absence of Emma's voice was somehow worse than hearing her death on loop. I turned to leave, to get back to the trail and my car and anywhere that wasn't this clearing where the trees remembered things that should have stayed buried with the dead. That's when I heard the new voice, coming from the same Douglas fir, already trapped and playing back, my own voice, from moments ago saying, "Please, I don't want to die." In a tone of panic I didn't remember using, in words I definitely hadn't spoken. The tree was playing memories that hadn't happened yet. I ran. The forest floor was slick with rain, and my boots couldn't find traction, and I fell twice, hard, my palms tearing on rough bark and sharp stones. Behind me, or maybe all around me, I could hear voices echoing from every tree. Hundreds of deaths playing simultaneously, overlapping, creating a chorus of final words and final breaths that followed me as I crashed through undergrowth looking for the trail. I heard Emma again. Multiple versions of her from different trees, different ages, different moments. I heard strangers I'd never met. Last words in languages I didn't understand, screams that cut off abruptly when the speakers stopped being able to scream. The old-growth forest had absorbed 1,000 years of deaths, had stored every final moment that occurred within its root network. And now it was playing them all at once like some nightmare symphony of human mortality. I found the trail by following the sound of the creek, that constant water over rocks that predated human voices and would continue long after. I followed it back to the trailhead, got in my car with muddy boots and torn hands, and drove away from Opal Creek without looking back. That night in my hotel room, I Googled the area, looking for reports of strange phenomena, of voices in trees, of anything that would confirm I hadn't experienced a psychotic break. I found historical records instead. The Opal Creek wilderness had been the site of intensive logging conflicts in the 80s and 90s. Environmental activists had tree sat for months to prevent old-growth cutting. Several people had died in accidents during the protests. Before that, it had been traditional territory for indigenous peoples who considered the area sacred, who spoke of trees holding spirits, who knew better than to listen too carefully to what the forest remembered. I never went back to grief counseling. How could I, when I knew the comfortable lies I'd been telling clients were exactly that? Lies. Death isn't peaceful. The dead don't find rest. Memory doesn't fade. It gets absorbed and stored and played back forever in the places where trauma occurred, in the trees that witness suffering, in the wood that will outlive us all by centuries. Sometimes at night I still hear it. Emma's voice, not asking me to scatter her ashes, but begging me to save her. Calling my name in that final hour, when the morphine stopped working and pain became her entire world. It doesn't come from memory anymore. It comes from outside my window, from the oak tree that grows in my apartment complex parking lot, from the telephone poles lining the street, from every piece of wood that might have roots deep enough to connect to other trees in other places, all of them sharing the stored audio of everyone who ever died badly. The box that held Emma's ashes sits empty on my shelf now. But I know she isn't really in that forest. She's everywhere, trapped in wood, playing on loop for anyone who stops to listen. The trees remember everything, and they never let go. If you're ever hiking in old-growth forests in Oregon, in those cathedral groves where the Douglas firs have stood for 1,000 years, Don't press your ear to the bark. Don't listen for voices in the wood. The memories stored there aren't meant for the living, and once you hear them, they follow you home in every creak of floorboards, every groan of roof beams, every whisper of wind through branches that learned human speech from the dying. Some forests are sacred because they're beautiful. Some are sacred because they remember everything we want to forget. I've been a land surveyor for the California Department of Parks and Recreation for 19 years, which means I've walked through just about every square mile of public land in Northern California, from the Mendocino coast to the Oregon border. My job is straightforward. Document boundaries, map terrain features, verify property lines, update GPS coordinates for trail systems. It's technical work that requires precision and a tolerance for solitude, both of which suit me perfectly. So when I was assigned to survey a remote section of old-growth redwood forest in Humboldt County, an area being considered for expansion of the state park system, I expected the usual. Dense forest, challenging topography, maybe some illegal marijuana grows to report. What I didn't expect was the staircase. It appeared on my third day of surveying, in a canyon so thick with ancient redwoods that the sunlight barely penetrated to the forest floor. I was establishing a benchmark point, hammering in a surveyor's monument, when I looked up and saw it rising into the canopy about 50 yards north of my position. At first, I thought it was a fire tower or some old forestry infrastructure from the logging era. But as I approached, I realized it was something else entirely. The staircase was made of what looked like wood, or something that resembled wood. But the construction was wrong. It spiraled upward in a tight helix, the steps perfectly uniform, each one exactly 7 inches high and 12 inches deep, rising into the redwood canopy with no visible support structure. No central pole, no cables, no engineering that would explain how it maintained structural integrity. It just climbed upward into the trees, defying basic physics. I documented it thoroughly, because that's what surveyors do. Photographed it from multiple angles, recorded GPS coordinates, measured the dimensions of the visible steps. The wood wasn't redwood, wasn't Douglas fir, wasn't any species I recognized from 2 decades of working in these forests. The grain pattern was too regular, almost artificial, and when I touched it, the surface felt neither warm nor cold, maintaining perfect ambient temperature regardless of the morning chill. The staircase started at ground level with no foundation, just the first step sitting on the forest floor like it had grown there, and it rose at least 100 feet before disappearing into the canopy, where the giant redwoods created their own ecosystem 400 feet above the ground. There was no visible destination, no platform, no structure at the top. It just climbed into increasingly dense foliage until perspective made it impossible to see where it ended. Professional curiosity won over common sense. I started climbing. The steps were solid under my boots, showing no flex or creak despite having no apparent support structure. As I spiraled upward, the forest floor receded below me and I entered the canopy layer where epiphytic ferns grew on. Every surface in the air tasted different, richer with moisture and decay. At about 60 feet up, roughly where the lowest branches of the mature redwoods began, I noticed the perspective was wrong. When I looked down, the forest floor appeared farther away than 60 feet. When I looked up, the canopy seemed closer than it should be given my elevation. The space between the steps wasn't consistent with normal 3-dimensional geometry. Each rotation of the spiral should have raised me by the height of 7 steps. But I was gaining elevation faster than that, covering vertical distance that didn't match the number of steps I'd climbed. at what my counting suggested was 80 feet. But what my surveyor's eye insisted was closer to 200. I reached a landing. It shouldn't have existed. The GPS unit on my belt showed I was still at ground level, elevation unchanged from where I'd started. My altimeter watch showed I'd climbed -40 feet, which was physically impossible. The landing was maybe 8 feet square, constructed from the same unknown wood, and it opened onto the trunk of a redwood that had been hollowed out. Not naturally hollow like some old-growth trees become, but precisely carved. The interior walls smooth and marked with symbols that looked almost like surveyor's marks, but in no system I'd ever learned. Through the hollow trunk I could see forest, but it wasn't the forest I'd been surveying. The trees were wrong. Too close together, too uniform in size, their trunks showing bark patterns that didn't match Sequoia sempervirens. I should have descended immediately and reported the structure to my supervisor. This was clearly some kind of elaborate art installation or illegal construction that needed to be investigated by rangers with law enforcement authority. But I'd spent 19 years documenting terrain, and my training demanded I map the full extent of any structure I encountered. So I stepped through the hollow trunk onto what I thought would be another section of Northern California redwood forest. The ground felt wrong under my boots. Too soft, too yielding, like walking on foam rather than forest duff. The light was wrong too, coming from a sun that was positioned where it shouldn't be for mid-morning in October. And when I turned to look back at the hollow trunk I'd stepped through, it wasn't there. Just more forest, extending in every direction, no landmark, no staircase, no way back. I pulled out my GPS unit and watched the coordinates flicker impossibly fast, cycling through locations that ranged across thousands of miles. Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, Alaska, coordinates that placed me in forests I'd never visited, but that showed the same uniform redwood stands I was currently seeing. My radio picked up chatter in languages that weren't quite English. Voices discussing survey work using terminology I didn't recognize, reporting elevation measurements that didn't match Earth's topography. I tried responding, identifying myself, requesting assistance, but no one acknowledged my transmissions. The voices kept discussing their work, mapping terrain that existed somewhere else, somewhere adjacent to where I was standing, but fundamentally separate. I started walking, trying to find any variation in the landscape, any landmark that would help me orient. But the forest was fractal. Every direction I walked showed the same pattern of redwoods at the same spacing, the same understory vegetation, the same diffuse light filtering through a canopy that never quite resolved into individual trees. After an hour of walking, I should have covered at least 2 miles. But when I checked my GPS, the coordinates were still flickering through that same impossible range. Distance wasn't working properly here, or direction, or any of the spatial relationships I'd spent 2 decades learning to measure and document with precision. This was a place where surveying had no meaning because the fundamental laws that made surveying possible didn't apply. That's when I saw the second staircase. It descended this time, spiraling down through the forest floor, the steps disappearing into earth that should have been solid, but somehow accommodated the structure. I had no better options, no other landmarks, no way to navigate in a forest that repeated infinitely in all directions. So I started descending, counting steps out of professional habit, documenting what I was experiencing even though I had no idea how to report it. The descent took longer than the climb. I counted 300 steps, then 500, then stopped counting because the numbers had lost meaning. The temperature didn't change. The light didn't dim. The forest continued around me, even though I was clearly underground by now, clearly descending through layers of earth that should have been dark and pressurized, but instead remained an impossible forest. The staircase ended at another landing, and through another hollow trunk I could see my original survey area. I recognized the specific pattern of trees, the benchmark monument I'd been hammering into the ground, the exact positioning of my equipment pack sitting where I'd left it. But when I stepped through, I was standing next to myself. Not a reflection, not a hallucination, an actual duplicate of me, dressed identically, holding the same surveyor's hammer I'd been using, in the process of marking the same benchmark I'd marked before I'd climbed the first staircase. The duplicate didn't see me. It continued working, completing the task, then looking up and noticing the staircase for what it thought was the first time. I watched myself approach the staircase, watched myself document it with photographs and measurements, watched myself make the decision to climb despite knowing better. The duplicate ascended out of sight, and I understood finally what the staircases were. Not structures, but connections between parallel versions of the same forest, the same moment, the same decision point. Somewhere in the redwood ecosystem, in the unique conditions created by these ancient trees that had grown here for millions of years before humans evolved, reality had developed folds. The staircases weren't built. They were revealed, made visible where the folds intersected, allowing passage between variations of the same location that existed simultaneously in overlapping dimensional spaces. I spent the next hour finding more staircases. They were everywhere once I knew how to look for them. Spiraling up into the canopy, descending through the forest floor, appearing between trees in configurations that shouldn't be structurally possible. I climbed one and found myself in a version of the forest where the surveying had been completed decades ago, where old boundary markers showed dates from 1987. I descended another and entered a forest where the redwoods had never been logged, where the canopy was so dense that the forest floor existed in permanent twilight, where trees grew closer together than any modern forest allowed. Each staircase led to a different fold, a different variation, and in some of them I saw other versions of myself. Some still surveying, some fleeing in panic, some sitting motionless on the forest floor like they'd given up trying to find their way back. On the 7th or 8th staircase, I'd lost count, lost any clear sense of which forest I'd started in. I found evidence that I wasn't the first surveyor to encounter this phenomenon. There was equipment scattered at the base of a descending staircase. Theodolites from the 1960s, hand-drawn maps showing survey lines that didn't match any California topology. Notebooks filled with increasingly frantic entries about stairs that led nowhere and forests that repeated forever. The final entry, dated 1973, read, "I've seen myself die in 12 different versions. The stairs show you all the ways your choices could have gone differently. Some of them lead to forests where you make it home. Most don't. I'm staying on a staircase that goes up forever. Better than watching yourself starve in another version of the same place." The notebook was signed by Robert Chen, a name I recognized from department history, a surveyor who disappeared in Humboldt County in 1973. Search called off after 3 weeks, body never found. I made the decision then to stop climbing, stop exploring, stop trying to understand the dimensional topology of these intersecting forests. I found a staircase that felt right, no rational reason, just intuition built from 19 years of navigating terrain, and followed it upward through maybe 200 steps. When I emerged through a hollow trunk, I was back in my original survey area, my equipment where I'd left it, the morning sun at the correct angle for the time elapsed since I'd first seen the staircase. But the staircase itself was gone. Just forest, uninterrupted canopy, no structure visible anywhere in the vicinity. My GPS showed the coordinates I'd recorded were now blank space on my mapping software. Coordinates that placed the structure in a location where satellite imagery showed only trees. I completed the survey over the next 4 days, documenting boundaries and terrain features and recommending the area for state park expansion. I didn't mention the staircases in my report, didn't include the photographs I'd taken. When I reviewed them later, they showed only forest, no structures, like the camera had refused to record what my eyes had seen. But I marked the coordinates privately, created my own map of where the intersections occurred, where reality folded enough to make the stairs visible. There were 17 of them in just that one canyon. And I suspected if I surveyed the entire old-growth redwood range, I'd find hundreds more, all hidden, all waiting for someone to look at the right angle and see the architecture that connects parallel versions of the same forest. I requested a transfer to the Sacramento office after that assignment. Took a position doing administrative surveying work that keeps me in cities where reality doesn't fold and staircases only go up and down in normal three-dimensional space. But sometimes I dream about those stairs, about climbing into the canopy and finding versions of my life that diverged at different decision points, about descending into forests where I made different choices and ended up different people. The redwoods have been growing for millions of years, long enough to accumulate dimensional instabilities the way they accumulate moisture from fog. Long enough for reality to develop weak points, where one version of the forest bleeds into another. The staircases are how you navigate between them. And once you've climbed one, once you've seen yourself in multiple variations living parallel lives, you understand that every choice is a staircase, and every staircase leads somewhere you didn't expect. Don't go looking for them in Northern California's old-growth forests. Don't climb stairs that shouldn't exist. And if you see yourself coming down as you're climbing up, don't ask which one of you is real. The answer is both and neither, and the stairs don't care about your existential crisis as long as you keep climbing. My thesis project was simple enough. Document anomalous rock formations in the North Cascades crystalline core domain, specifically focusing on metamorphic structures that didn't fit established models of terrain accretion. The technical language was my advisor's way of saying, go find weird rocks and take pictures, which suited me perfectly. I was 26, finishing my master's in geology at University of Washington, and I'd spent 3 summers hiking through Washington's Cascade Range cataloging oddities that didn't match the textbook formation processes. Most were explainable. Unusual erosion patterns, rare mineral inclusions, the occasional misidentified stone that turned out to be exactly what it should be. But the stones I found in a remote drainage basin east of Glacier Peak were different enough that I spent 2 weeks documenting them before I understood what I was actually looking at. They were scattered across maybe a square mile of alpine terrain, above the tree line where only Krumholtz and lichen survived the harsh winters. At first, I cataloged them as erratics, boulders transported by glaciers during the Ice Age and deposited randomly when the ice retreated. But the distribution pattern was wrong. They were positioned in a grid, each stone approximately 50 meters from its nearest neighbor, arranged with precision that couldn't be natural. And they were all the same type of rock, a metamorphic schist that shouldn't have existed in this specific location based on the geological surveys. The Chihuahua Schist Formation was 30 miles south. These stones had no business being here unless something had transported them deliberately, which would mean pre-Columbian engineering on a scale that would rewrite North American archaeological records. I spent the first week measuring, photographing, taking core samples for mineralogical analysis. Standard geological fieldwork documented meticulously in my field notebook with GPS coordinates and stratigraphic context. The stones averaged about 4 feet tall and maybe 2 feet wide. Irregular in shape, but all oriented the same direction, magnetic north, I confirmed with my compass. which was unusual but not unprecedented for certain iron-rich metamorphic formations. What made them remarkable were the carvings. Not obviously carved, not at first glance, but when sunlight hit at specific angles, early morning or late afternoon, shallow grooves became visible on the surfaces. They looked like eyes, not stylized or abstract, but anatomically detailed. With irises and pupils carved in concentric circles, with subtle variations that suggested whoever created them understood human ocular anatomy. On day 8, I realized the eyes were tracking me. Not moving, not literally following, but positioned such that no matter where I stood in the grid, at least 3 stones appeared to be looking directly at me. It was a trick of perspective, I told myself. The same optical illusion that makes the Mona Lisa's eyes seem to follow viewers. But when I tested it systematically, walking a grid pattern and photographing each stone from multiple angles, the illusion held from every position. The carvings had been designed with 3-dimensional precision to create the sensation of being watched regardless of viewer location. That level of geometric sophistication suggested astronomical knowledge, mathematical understanding that supposedly didn't exist in North America until European contact. I started revising my thesis focus from geology to archaeology. On day 12, the stones turned. I'd set up my tent at the center of the grid, poor archaeological practice I knew. But I was a geologist, not an archaeologist. And I needed to document the site from multiple angles over a 24-hour period to understand how the carvings changed with lighting conditions. I woke up at 2 a.m. to photograph the stones under starlight, and every single carved eye had rotated to face my tent. Not literally rotated, they were still stone, still locked in their metamorphic crystal structure. But the pupils had shifted position within the carved irises. Maybe half an inch, maybe less, but enough that the geometric sight lines no longer radiated outward in their careful distribution. Now they converged, all of them, on my specific GPS coordinates. I told myself it was impossible. Stone doesn't move without seismic activity, and I'd had seismometers running since day 1 as part of my baseline geological monitoring. No tremors, no ground movement, nothing that would explain shifting rock formations. I documented everything with photographs, with measurements, with core samples that showed the same metamorphic structure as before. But when I compared my day 1 photos to my day 12 photos using digital overlay techniques, the pupils had definitely moved. Approximately 0.4 inches toward my position. A movement that should have required either impossible precision carving to create depth-based optical illusions, or actual physical displacement of metamorphic schist that had been stable for millions of years. I started excavating on day 13, digging carefully around the base of the nearest stone with the idea that maybe it was mounted on some kind of rotating mechanism, some pre-Columbian engineering that would explain the movement. What I found instead was roots. Not tree roots, we were above the tree line, but something that looked organic, that branched and subdivided like vascular tissue, connecting the stones in an underground network. I collected samples, documented them in my field notebook, and tried to identify the species. The tissue was plant-like in structure, but had the mineral composition of stone, like it was in some transitional state between organic and inorganic matter. When I cut one of the root structures to collect a sample, liquid seeped out, dark, viscous, with a composition my field test kit couldn't identify. That night, the stones got closer. I'd marked their positions with surveyor stakes, standard practice for archaeological documentation. And when I woke at dawn to continue excavating, 3 stones had moved inward by approximately 2 meters. Not rolled, not toppled, but relocated with their carved eyes still aligned still watching, still connected underground by those root structures that might have been carrying signals or nutrients or information between them. I packed my equipment immediately, prepared to hike back to the trailhead and request backup from my advisor and possibly the USGS and definitely someone with archaeological credentials who could explain what I was documenting. Before I could leave, I found the entrance. It wasn't there on day one. I'd mapped the entire grid, would have noticed a cave opening. But now, at the exact center of the stone circle, the ground had subsided to reveal stairs descending into bedrock that shouldn't have been hollow. The stairs were carved from the same Snoqualmie schist as the watching stones, with the same careful precision, descending at a uniform angle with uniform riser height. This was architecture, not geology. This was engineering that required surveying equipment and mathematical knowledge and social organization to coordinate labor. This was evidence of a civilization in the North Cascades that predated anything in the archaeological record. I should have left. Every graduate school safety protocol I'd learned said, "Don't enter uncharted caves alone. Don't deviate from your research plan without advisor approval. Don't risk your life for data when you can come back with proper equipment." But I was 26 and stupid, and looking at a discovery that would make my career. So I descended. The stairs went down maybe 50 feet before opening into a chamber carved from bedrock. The walls showed more carved eyes, hundreds of them, all directed toward the center of the chamber where a larger stone stood. Maybe 12 feet tall, carved with such anatomical detail that I could see corneal striations and the subtle asymmetry of natural iris patterns. And this one was looking at me with pupils that tracked my movement perfectly as I walked the perimeter of the chamber. The chamber was part of something larger. I found tunnels branching off in 4 directions, all aligned to cardinal points, all descending further into the bedrock that, according to geological surveys, should have been solid metamorphic rock from terrain accretion processes millions of years ago. But someone, something, had carved through it, creating spaces that extended far beyond what I could map with my equipment. I followed the north tunnel for maybe 200 feet before I started finding the shells. That's the only word that fits. They looked like massive cicada shells, the empty exoskeletons left behind after molting, but human-sized. No, larger than human, maybe 8 feet tall when standing, with proportions that were almost right, but distorted in ways that suggested they weren't meant for bipedal movement. The shells were stone, the same Snoqualmie schist as everything else, but hollow, formed in the shape of something that once occupied them. I examined one closely with my headlamp and saw details that shouldn't exist. Internal structure like organs, branching patterns like nervous systems, all rendered in stone like some impossible fossil of a creature that was part organic and part mineral. And in the torso section, carved with the same precision as the eyes above ground, was a hollow cavity exactly the size and shape of a human being curled in fetal position. I understood then what the stones were. Not monuments, not art, not ancient astronomical markers. They were sentinels, guards, possibly containers for something that existed in the transitional state between life and mineral, between organic consciousness and geological timescales. The Cascade Range had formed through terrain accretion, pieces of ocean floor and volcanic islands that had drifted together over millions of years and collided with North America. The conventional geology said those terrains were lifeless rock. But what if something had been living in them, something that operated on geological timescales, that could hibernate in stone for millions of years and only wake when conditions were right? The tunnel behind me began to collapse. Not dramatically, not like a cave-in, but settling, compacting, closing with the kind of gradual pressure that turns sediment into metamorphic rock over millions of years. I ran back toward the entrance chamber, and the walls were moving, not quickly, but visibly, the carved eyes tracking my movement as the stone itself contracted around the spaces I'd just been exploring. I made it to the stairs and climbed, my boots slipping on smooth schist, my equipment abandoned in the chamber below, because survival took priority over data. The stairs were contracting too, each step becoming shallower as the rock compressed, like the entire structure had decided it was time to return to the solid bedrock state it had temporarily abandoned. I emerged at ground level to find the grid of watching stones had moved inward, forming a tight circle around the entrance, maybe 20 feet in diameter. All the carved eyes faced inward now, looking down at the stairs I'd just climbed. And in the dawn light, I could see the pupils rotating in their carved irises, tracking independently like they were focusing on something emerging behind me. I ran. I left my tent, my core samples, my field notebooks with 2 weeks of documentation, all of it abandoned at the site, while I sprinted downslope toward the tree line and the trail that would take me back to civilization. I reported it to my advisor, to the USGS, to the Forest Service rangers who managed that section of the North Cascades. They sent a team to investigate 2 weeks later and found nothing. No stones in a grid pattern, no carved eyes, no entrance to underground chambers. Just typical alpine terrain with the expected bedrock composition and no evidence of archaeological features. They suggested I'd experienced altitude sickness, maybe early-stage hypothermia, maybe psychological stress from extended solo fieldwork. My thesis advisor recommended I take a semester off and consider whether graduate school was the right path for me. But I have the photographs, saved on memory cards they never asked to see. The images show the stones, show the carved eyes, show the movement between days 1 and 12. And when I zoom in on the high-resolution files, when I examine the background terrain behind each stone, I can see shapes in the rock. Human-shaped, curled in fetal positions, embedded in the metamorphic schist like bodies preserved in amber. Dozens of them scattered across the alpine basin, maybe hundreds, all oriented the same direction, all waiting for whatever geological trigger tells them it's time to wake up and molt their stone shells and resume whatever existence they had before they went dormant. I dropped out of the geology program and moved to Arizona, where the rocks are sedimentary and young, and nothing has been waiting millions of years to wake up. But sometimes, I check the seismic monitoring data for the North Cascades, watching for unusual patterns, for tremors that don't match standard tectonic activity. Because the Cascade Range is still actively forming, still being shaped by terrain accretion and volcanic activity, and the collision of tectonic plates. And if something went dormant in those terrains millions of years ago, if something learned to hibernate in stone and wait for the right conditions, then every earthquake is a potential alarm clock. Don't go looking for carved stones in the high Cascades. Don't examine rocks that seem to watch you as you pass. And if you find yourself surrounded by stones with eyes, don't stay to document them. They're not monuments. They're guards, watching over sleepers who measured time in mountain building events and who consider human civilization a brief moment between one geological epoch and the next. I'd been volunteering with King County Search and Rescue for 6 years, responding to maybe 40 calls a year, lost hikers, injured climbers, the occasional hypothermia case when someone underestimated how quickly October weather turns deadly in the Cascades. Most missions ended well, with cold but grateful people extracted from situations that would have killed them if they'd waited much longer. We trained constantly for the difficult scenarios: avalanche recovery, technical rope rescue, wilderness trauma care. But nothing in the training manual prepared me for what we found on the Commonwealth Basin Trail that Thursday in late October. The call came in at 3 p.m. Male hiker, 28 years old, reported overdue by his girlfriend after failing to return from a solo day hike. Last known position was the Commonwealth Basin Trailhead off I-90 near Snoqualmie Pass, planning to summit Red Mountain and return before dark. Standard search parameters, textbook scenario, exactly the kind of mission we ran successfully dozens of times every season. Our team of 8 deployed by 4 p.m., hiking in with full packs, medical supplies, communications equipment. We expected to find someone with a sprained ankle or dead phone battery, maybe mildly hypothermic, but otherwise fine. We found him in 40 minutes, sitting on a log maybe 2 miles up the trail, wearing the exact clothes his girlfriend had described, matching the photo she'd provided. He saw us approaching and waved, called out thanks for coming to get him, apologized for the trouble. His voice was right. His face matched the photo. His hiking boots showed the distinctive yellow laces the girlfriend had mentioned. But something was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not anything I could articulate in my initial assessment. Just a subtle wrongness that made my training-honed instincts scream in ways they never had during 6 years of rescue work. He moved slightly too smoothly when he stood, like his joints had been over-lubricated. His breathing was too regular for someone who'd supposedly been lost and stressed for hours. And when he smiled at us, the expression didn't quite reach his eyes. Like he'd learned smiling from watching videos rather than from actual emotion. My partner Jake did the medical assessment while I radioed our position to command. Temperature normal, blood pressure normal, pupils reactive, no signs of injury or exposure. The hiker, his name was Marcus Chen according to the missing person report, answered all our questions appropriately. He'd gotten turned around after summiting Red Mountain, followed what he thought was the trail but ended up off route. Finally found his way back to the main path about an hour ago. Textbook explanation. Exactly what happens today hikers unfamiliar with how quickly trails disappear in heavy forest. But Jake kept shooting me looks that said he felt it too. That subtle wrongness that didn't fit any medical diagnosis we'd been trained to recognize. We started escorting Marcus down trail toward the parking area where his girlfriend was waiting with law enforcement. Standard procedure, keep the subject talking to assess mental state. Watch for delayed shock or injury that might not have been apparent in initial assessment. Marcus talked appropriately about his hike, about the weather, about being grateful we'd found him so quickly. But he never asked questions. Never asked who we were, which unit we represented, how we'd been notified. Never showed curiosity about the rescue process. Never displayed the normal relief followed by embarrassment that characterized most successful recoveries. He just walked with us, matching our pace exactly, smiling that not quite right smile. We were maybe a mile from the trailhead when Jake's radio crackled with traffic from another SAR unit operating on the Kendall Catwalk Trail, about 3 miles east of our position. They'd found a male hiker matching Marcus Chen's description, unconscious but alive, suffering from exposure and dehydration. The unit was requesting immediate medical evacuation, preparing to carry the subject out on a litter. I looked at Jake, then at Marcus walking beside us, and felt my stomach drop. Marcus, our Marcus, had stopped walking and was staring at the radio with an expression I can only describe as confusion, like he was processing information he didn't know how to interpret. I keyed my radio and requested the other unit to confirm the subject's identification. They came back with details that matched perfectly. Yellow boot laces, specific jacket brand, wallet with ID showing Marcus Chen, birth date matching our missing person report. Everything identical to the man standing 3 feet from me. I asked them to describe any distinguishing marks, and they reported a surgical scar on the subject's left knee from a mountaineering accident, clearly visible and recently treated. I looked at Marcus, at his hiking pants, and asked him to show me his left knee. He hesitated for the first time since we'd found him, that smooth confidence flickering. Then he rolled up his pants leg and showed us a knee with no scar, no marks, skin that looked like it had never been injured. Jake pulled his knife, not aggressively, not like he was planning to attack. Just that instinctive movement when something stops being a rescue subject and becomes a threat you can't categorize. Marcus, or whatever was wearing Marcus's appearance, took 3 steps backward, and I saw his hiking boots sink into the trail surface deeper than they should have, like he weighed significantly less than his apparent body mass suggested. His expression went blank, completely neutral, and he spoke in Marcus's voice, but with flatter affect. "This is unexpected. The extraction usually completes before duplicate discovery." Then he turned and ran off trail into the heavy brush, moving faster than any human should move, certainly faster than someone who'd supposedly been lost and exhausted for hours. We reported to command immediately. Possible imposter, real subject located on Kendall Catwalk, unknown individual fled into forest. Command ordered us to maintain position and wait for law enforcement support, while the other unit evacuated the actual Marcus Chen. We stood on that trail for 20 minutes, watching the tree line where the duplicate had disappeared, trying to explain to our team lead over radio what we'd witnessed without sounding insane. That's when we heard the screaming. Not from the direction the duplicate had fled, but from below us, from somewhere underneath the trail itself. Multiple voices screaming in unison, muffled by earth and rock, but close enough that we could hear distinct words. "Help us. Please. We're still here." It took our faces. Jake and I looked at each other, made the decision that would end both our SAR careers, and went off trail to investigate. We found the entrance 30 feet from the main path, hidden behind a deadfall that had been arranged to look natural, but was actually concealing a shaft descending into bedrock. The screaming was louder here, echoing up from depths we couldn't see. I anchored a rope to a solid tree, set up a rappel, and descended despite every protocol that said wait for backup, wait for proper equipment, wait for law enforcement. But those were human voices, people in distress, and we were trained to respond to exactly that. The shaft opened into a chamber about 20 feet down, carved from the granite bedrock that forms the Cascade Range. Our headlamps showed a space maybe 40 feet across, with walls that showed tool marks, deliberate excavation. And hanging from the ceiling on some kind of organic webbing were bodies. Not dead bodies. Living people, suspended in a semi-conscious state, their faces slack, their breathing shallow. I counted 7 of them before Jake grabbed my arm and pointed at the floor. There were shells there, human-shaped hollows made from something that looked like papier-mâché but was actually skin. Empty skins, perfectly detailed down to fingerprints and pores, arranged on the chamber floor like discarded clothes. We heard movement from a tunnel leading deeper into the mountain. Multiple footsteps, approaching fast, and when they entered our headlamp beams, we saw more duplicates. Men and women we'd never seen before, moving with that same too-smooth motion, their expressions neutral and focused. They were carrying another shell between them, fresh and wet, still forming. And behind them was Marcus. Our Marcus, the duplicate we'd found on the trail. He looked at us without emotion and said, "You've contaminated the harvest site. The extraction process requires isolation to complete the transfer. Your presence has invalidated this location." We ran. Jake went up the rope first, while I held position, watching the duplicates approach with that unhurried confidence that said they knew we couldn't escape, that the chamber had only one exit and they controlled it. But Jake was fast on rope systems, faster than the duplicates apparently expected, and he pulled me up just as the first one reached for my ankle. We collapsed the deadfall behind us, blocked the shaft entrance with every piece of dead wood we could move, and sprinted back to the main trail while radioing for immediate law enforcement and Forest Service support. Command thought we'd lost our minds. Our team lead ordered us to remain at the trailhead and submit to psychological evaluation. But they sent units anyway, because protocol demands investigation of any underground structure discovery, any report of persons in distress. They found the shaft exactly where we'd described. They found the chamber, found the suspended bodies. 5 hikers reported missing over the past 3 months in the Snoqualmie Pass area, plus 2 more we later identified as long-term missing persons from as far back as 2018. All alive, all recovered, all hospitalized in critical condition with severe dehydration and malnutrition, but no other injuries. They also found 23 shells, empty skin suits arranged in careful rows, including one that DNA testing later confirmed had been worn by something pretending to be Marcus Chen. What they didn't find was any tunnel leading deeper into the mountain. The chamber just ended in solid rock walls, no passages, no exit except the shaft we'd descended. The survivors couldn't explain what happened. Most had no memory of anything after the initial attack, something ambushing them on trail, something that moved too fast to see clearly, and then waking up in the hospital weeks or months later. But 2 of them, the most recent victims, remembered fragments. Being held in the chamber while something wearing their face learned to move like them, speak like them, rehearsing their mannerisms and memories extracted through some process they couldn't describe. One woman, a software engineer from Bellevue who'd gone missing in early September, said the duplicates called it harvesting. They were studying us, learning human behavior by wearing our skins and living our lives for a few days before discarding the shells and returning underground to report what they'd learned to something deeper in the mountain. Something that was collecting information about surface-dwelling humans for purposes she didn't want to speculate about. Jake and I were thanked for the rescue, then quietly removed from active SAR duties pending psychiatric evaluation. The official story reported it as a human trafficking operation, an elaborate kidnapping scheme, though no arrests were ever made and no suspects ever identified. The Forest Service sealed the shaft with concrete, posted the area as closed due to unstable geology, removed it from trail maps. But I check the missing person reports obsessively now, watching for patterns around Snoqualmie Pass, around the Commonwealth, Basin Trailhead, around any location where hikers disappear and then reappear with stories that don't quite fit, with behaviors that are almost right but subtly wrong. Because here's what keeps me awake. We only found 7 bodies in that chamber, but there were 23 shells, which means 16 duplicates completed the harvesting process, walked out of the forest wearing human faces, integrated into human society, and are currently living among us, reporting back to whatever exists in the deeper tunnels about human behavior, human weakness, human infrastructure. Marcus Chen has no memory of anything after the attack. But his girlfriend says he's different now, more careful, more observant, asking questions about things he should already know. She attributes it to trauma, to the psychological impact of whatever he experienced during his missing period. But sometimes she catches him standing perfectly still, staring at nothing, his expression completely neutral. And for just a moment, he doesn't look quite human. Don't hike alone in the Cascades, especially around Snoqualmie Pass where the trails get less traffic and the granite bedrock goes deep. Don't assume you know someone just because they look right and sound right and move mostly right. And if you're ever part of a search and rescue operation that finds its subject too quickly, too easily, sitting calmly on a trail when they should be panicked and exhausted, check for the small details. Check for scars that should be there. Check for the wrongness in how they smile. Because some things in these mountains have learned that the best way to study humanity is to wear us like clothing. And the shells they leave behind are just the ones that didn't fit properly. The successful harvests are walking among us. And you'd never know unless you looked very, very carefully at the small imperfections they haven't quite mastered yet. I'd been through hiking the Pacific Crest Trail for 93 days, covering nearly 1,800 miles from the Mexican border to the Mount Jefferson Wilderness in Central Oregon. My body had transformed into something efficient and mechanical. Legs that ate miles without complaint, lungs adapted to thin air, mind comfortable with solitude and discomfort. The trail had become routine by this point. Just endless forward motion through landscapes that varied but never surprised. Until I entered the section south of Jefferson Park where the trail started bleeding. It appeared first as moisture on the packed dirt, dark spots that I initially mistook for mud or water seepage. But the consistency was wrong. Thicker, more viscous, with that distinctive iron smell that anyone who's dealt with injuries recognizes immediately as blood. I stopped hiking and crouched to examine it more carefully. Fresh blood, human red, not animal brown, seeping up through the trail surface like it was welling from a wound underneath. I looked around for an injured animal, for any logical source, but saw only typical forest. Douglas fir and mountain hemlock, the understory mix of huckleberry and beargrass that characterized this elevation. Nothing that explained blood on the trail. I kept walking because that's what you do on long-distance hikes. You keep moving forward. You trust that strange things have explanations. You don't let minor oddities derail your momentum. But the blood spots increased in frequency. Every 10 feet, then every 5 feet, then continuously, until I was walking on a trail that wept red from its surface like skin with capillaries too close to the surface. My boots left prints in it, dark tracks that filled slowly with more seepage as I passed. I pulled out my phone to document this, to have evidence for the trail report I'd file later. But the camera showed only normal dirt trail. The viewfinder image didn't match what my eyes were seeing. A technological failure that sent the first real spike of fear through my tired brain. The blood began flowing, not seeping anymore but moving with direction, running downhill where the trail descended, pooling in low spots, creating rivulets that followed the path's contours. I was effectively hiking through a shallow stream of blood, my boots splashing in it, the smell overwhelming and nauseating. I tried stepping off trail into the forest, but the blood was there too, flowing between the trees, soaking into the duff, staining everything it touched. This wasn't coming from the trail surface anymore. It was coming from everywhere. From the ground itself, like the entire forest was hemorrhaging. I checked my GPS to verify my location, planning to exit at the next road crossing and report this to Forest Service rangers who would have equipment to test the substance, to identify the source, to provide rational explanations. But my GPS coordinates were wrong. According to the satellite data, I was 3 miles west of the Pacific Crest Trail, deep in the Mount Jefferson Wilderness backcountry, where no maintained trails existed. I recalibrated, waited for signal acquisition, checked again. Same impossible location. The trail I was standing on, the trail I'd been following all morning with its distinctive PCT markers and well-maintained tread, apparently didn't exist according to the technology that had guided me for 93 days. That's when I heard the trees. Not wind through branches, but something that sounded disturbingly like breathing. Deep, labored inhalations followed by shuddering exhales. The sound came from everywhere at once, synchronized across the forest. And with each exhale, the blood flow increased, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the breathing. I approached the nearest Douglas fir and placed my palm against the bark. Warmth, like body heat, and that same rhythmic pulsing underneath. Like heartbeat translated through wood fiber. The tree was alive in ways trees aren't supposed to be alive, with circulatory systems that mimicked animal biology, with warm blood flowing through cambium layers that should contain only sap and water. I started running. The trail descended toward what my map showed as Milk Creek, a destination with water, with a named landmark, with the possibility of other hikers who could confirm this wasn't hallucination or altitude psychosis. But the blood flow ran contrary to gravity now, flowing uphill, flowing against the physical laws that govern fluids. It moved with purpose, channeling into streams that merged and grew larger, creating rivers that flowed upward through the forest toward Mount Jefferson's peak, and floating in the blood, not dissolved, but suspended like they were being transported deliberately, were chunks of wood, fresh cut wood, still showing saw marks, still bleeding sap mixed with the blood. Pieces of trees that had been logged recently, even though this was protected wilderness, where commercial logging hadn't been legal for decades. I remembered reading about the logging history in Central Oregon, the massive operations from the 1920s through the 1970s, the railroad logging that had stripped thousands of acres, the camps that employed hundreds of workers to cut the ancient forest and ship it out for lumber. This area around Mount Jefferson had been heavily logged before wilderness designation in 1968 protected what remained. But the forest remembered, apparently. The stumps and slash piles had decomposed back into soil, had fed new growth, had been incorporated into the ecosystem's regeneration. And now that decomposed tissue was returning as blood, carrying with it the wood that had been stolen, flowing upward to healing wounds that had never properly closed. I reached Milk Creek and found it running red, the water completely displaced by blood flowing from upstream sources in quantities that defied any natural explanation. The creek was maybe 15 feet wide here, running fast with spring snowmelt that should have been clear and cold. Instead, it was a river of blood, warm when I tested it with my hand, carrying more wood chunks and also something else. Fragments of metal, old logging equipment, rusted saw blades and cable chokers that had been buried in the forest floor for 70 years and were now being expelled like foreign objects from a wound. The forest was purging everything human, everything that didn't belong to the ecosystem that had existed here for millennia before we arrived with our saws and ambitions. The bleeding intensified as I tried to cross the creek. Blood erupted from the ground in geysers, spraying upward with pressure that suggested underground reservoirs, underground vessels pumping fluid through a root network that extended miles in all directions. I was soaked in it within seconds. My clothes heavy with blood that wasn't mine, that wasn't any creature's. That came from the collective trauma of a forest that had been wounded and left to heal itself without acknowledgement or restitution. And in the blood I could see images. Not hallucinations, but actual visual information. Memories stored in the fluid itself, showing me the logging operations, showing me the trees falling, showing me the camps and the workers and the railroad, carrying away everything this forest had grown over centuries. I understood finally that this wasn't random. The forest was showing me specifically, was directing this hemorrhage at me because I was human, because I carried the collective responsibility for what had been done here. The Pacific Crest Trail might follow a protected wilderness route, but it still cut through terrain, still represented human intrusion into space that wanted to remain wild. Every footprint I'd left in the last 93 days was a small violation, and the forest was rejecting those violations, was using blood as the medium to communicate pain that couldn't be expressed in any language humans had evolved to understand. I climbed. The blood was flowing upward toward Mount Jefferson's summit, and some instinct told me that was where I needed to go to end this, to understand what the forest wanted from me. I left the trail and followed the blood flow through old-growth stands that had survived the logging era, through sections where trees showed saw marks from operations that had been interrupted by wilderness designation, through slash piles that had become nurse logs supporting new growth that was now bleeding from wounds inherited from its predecessors. The elevation gain was brutal. I was climbing maybe 1,500 feet per mile, far steeper than any maintained trail, my legs screaming from 93 days of use, my lungs struggling with the altitude and the blood. I couldn't avoid breathing when it sprayed around me. I reached a clearing at maybe 8,000 feet, well above where most vegetation grows, in the volcanic rock zone where only lichen and desperate alpine plants survive. The blood converged here, flowing from all directions, creating a pool that looked like a wound in the mountain itself. And standing in the center of the pool, growing directly from the blood, was a tree. Not a species I recognized, not anything that matched Oregon ecology. Its bark was smooth and dark like burned wood. Its branches spread in patterns that suggested deliberate design rather than natural growth. And every surface wept blood continuously, feeding the pool, sustaining the flow that had drawn me here. The tree showed me everything, not through words or sounds, but through direct knowledge transfer, information appearing in my mind, fully formed. The logging operations from the 1920s had cut too deep, had taken trees that were so old they'd become part of the forest's consciousness network. The elder nodes that coordinated communication between the younger growth. Without those elders, the forest had fragmented, had lost the ability to communicate as a unified organism, had spent decades in isolation trauma trying to regrow what had been lost. This blood, this was the reconnection process. The forest using iron-rich sap and decomposed tissue from logged trees to rebuild the circulatory network that had been severed. And it needed sacrifice to complete the healing, needed human blood to mix with the forest blood, needed acknowledgement of the wound through the wounding of those who caused it. I should have run, should have descended as fast as possible back to the official trail, should have reported all of this to authorities who would investigate and find nothing because forests don't bleed, except when they're observed by those the forest chooses to show. But I was 2,700 miles from Mexico, close enough to Canada that quitting now felt impossible. And somewhere beneath the fear was guilt. The kind of species-level guilt that comes from knowing your existence depends on resources taken from systems you don't understand and can never repay. So I did what the forest was asking. I found a sharp piece of volcanic rock and opened a cut on my palm. Let my blood drip into the pool where it mixed with the forest blood and disappeared into whatever circulation system existed beneath the mountain. The bleeding stopped. Not gradually, but instantly, like a switch being flipped, the flow ceasing midstream and the blood already on the ground, soaking instantly into the soil. The tree in the center of the pool continued weeping from its bark. But the flow was slower now, more sustainable, like it had achieved the pressure equalization it needed to function properly. I felt the forest's attention shift away from me. Felt the focus that had been so intense and terrifying redirect to the larger work of rebuilding its fractured consciousness network. I was dismissed, no longer relevant. My tiny contribution absorbed into the massive project of ecological healing that would continue long after I finished my hike and forgot this ever happened. I made it back to the Pacific Crest Trail by nightfall, My GPS suddenly functional again, the coordinates matching my position perfectly. My hand throbbed where I'd cut it. The wound looked days old already, healing with unnatural speed, the scar tissue dark like wood grain. I hiked another 300 miles to Canada, finished the trail in early October, and told people I'd completed a successful through hike without major incident. But I checked the Mount Jefferson wilderness reports obsessively now, watching for other hikers who mention blood on the trail, who describe forests that breathe and bleed, and remember everything we've done to them over the past century of industrial resource extraction. Because here's what I understand now that I didn't before. The forests aren't passive. They're not scenic backdrops for our recreation or sustainable resources for our economy. They're organisms operating on timescales we can barely perceive, with communication networks we're only beginning to understand. And they remember the violence we've inflicted with the same permanence that tree rings record drought years and fire scars. The bleeding will continue in forests across the Pacific Northwest where logging wounds still haven't healed, where the elder trees that coordinated consciousness were cut before we understood what we were destroying. And sometimes those forests will call humans to witness the damage, to participate in the healing, to give back tiny fractions of what was taken. Don't ignore blood on the trail if you see it in Oregon's wilderness areas. Don't assume it's animal injury or natural phenomenon. Follow it to its source, offer what it asks for, and understand that you're not just a hiker passing through. You're a member of the species responsible for wounds that bleed across decades, and the forest knows exactly who you are. My podcast, Pacific Ghost Stories, had 47 episodes and maybe 12,000 regular listeners when I decided to do location recording in Oregon's Siuslaw National Forest. The concept was simple. Record in supposedly haunted locations, interview people who'd experienced unexplained phenomena, layer in atmospheric sound from the actual sites to give listeners that authentic, creepy forest ambiance. Production value was everything in the podcast space, and nothing beat genuine field recordings for creating immersion. I'd booked a dispersed camping site deep in the Drift Creek wilderness area, planned 3 days of recording interviews with locals who'd agreed to share their stories, and packed enough equipment to capture high-quality audio in the notoriously damp coastal forest conditions. This was going to be my breakthrough season. The content that would push me from hobbyist to professional podcaster with actual sponsorship revenue. The first interview went perfectly. I'd connected with a woman named Sarah through a paranormal enthusiasts forum. She'd had an experience on the Cummins Creek Trail 5 years ago, something about losing time and hearing voices that didn't match any known wildlife. We met at the trailhead parking area in the morning, hiked maybe a mile into the old growth section where Sitka spruce grew thick enough to block most sunlight, and I set up my recording equipment in a small clearing. Standard podcast format. I asked questions. She told her story. I captured 30 minutes of content that would edit down beautifully with some atmospheric layering and maybe a musical sting at the dramatic moments. She was articulate, her pacing was good, and the story had exactly the kind of ambiguous ending that kept listeners engaged without requiring them to believe anything supernatural had actually occurred. I noticed the echo while reviewing the footage that evening at my campsite. Sarah's voice on the recording was clear, exactly as I remembered from the interview. But underneath it was something else. Not quite an echo. More like a second voice speaking the same words with fractionally different timing. I assumed it was audio artifact, maybe some kind of phase cancellation from wind hitting my microphones. So I made a note to add noise reduction in post-production and moved on to preparing for the next day's interview. But when I listened again with headphones, really focusing on that secondary voice, I realized it wasn't Sarah's voice at all. It was mine, speaking her words with her inflection, like something had been listening to both of us and was practicing the conversation. The second interview was with a retired Forest Service ranger who'd worked the Siuslaw for 30 years before taking early retirement after an incident he wouldn't specify over email. We met at a dispersed camping area near Mary's Peak, the highest point in the Oregon Coast Range, where the western hemlock grew so dense you could barely see 20 feet in any direction. He told me about sounds in the forest that didn't match known wildlife, about equipment malfunctions in specific locations, about the way certain trails seemed to change configuration between patrols even though no maintenance had been performed. Good content. Exactly the kind of authoritative but unsettling material that made for compelling podcasting. I was excited about the episode structure forming in my head when he said something that made me check my recording levels. Just like you said in episode 33 about how the forest remembers. You were right about that. I hadn't said that in episode 33. I'd never used that phrase in any episode. My show focused on personal experiences, not metaphysical speculation about forest consciousness. But the ranger insisted, described the exact context, quoted my supposed words with precision that suggested he'd listened multiple times. I pulled out my phone and checked the episode right there, streaming it over the spotty cellular connection, and he was right. My voice, my delivery, saying words I'd never spoken about forests as living memory systems. Except I had no memory of recording that segment. And when I checked my production notes, that section wasn't in my original script. It was just there, inserted seamlessly into the episode, mixed at perfect levels, indistinguishable from the content I'd actually created. I canceled the third interview and spent the afternoon reviewing every episode I'd published. The pattern was impossible to miss once I knew to look for it. Starting around episode 20, maybe 6 months ago, there were segments I didn't remember recording. Nothing dramatic, just small additions. A sentence here, a paragraph there, observations about Pacific Northwest forests, and the things that lived in them. The early insertions were crude, clearly not my voice, even though they tried to match my tone. But they'd gotten better with each episode, more refined, until by episode 40, the inserted content was indistinguishable from my actual recording. Whatever was adding these segments had been learning, practicing, improving its mimicry of human speech patterns by studying my production style. That night at my campsite, I reviewed the Sarah interview recording again with fresh attention. The secondary voice wasn't just practicing her words. It was practicing mine too, the questions I'd asked, the sympathetic noises I'd made while she spoke, the way I said, "Tell me more about that," when I wanted her to elaborate. And underneath both our voices was a third layer, barely audible even with my studio-grade headphones, speaking in overlapping whispers that sounded like dozens of voices attempting the same words simultaneously. They weren't quite synchronized, creating a discordant chorus that made my skin crawl. Something had been present during the interview, listening, recording, practicing alongside my equipment. I packed my gear immediately, planning to hike out at first light and delete every episode from my hosting platform, destroy whatever I'd been inadvertently creating for the past 6 months. But when I tried to access my podcast dashboard, the login credentials didn't work. Someone had changed the password, locked me out of my own show, and was continuing to publish episodes. Episode 48 had gone live while I was reviewing the recordings. I could see it in my podcast app, already accumulating downloads and reviews. The episode was titled, "Recording in Siuslaw." And when I played it, I heard my voice describing exactly what I'd been doing for the past 2 days. Except I hadn't recorded any of that content. The voice was mine, the production quality matched my style, but the words were describing my activities from an external perspective, like something had been watching me and narrating my actions in real time. The entity had been using my podcast to learn human communication, I understood finally. Not just speech patterns, but the entire framework of how we structure narrative, build suspense, create emotional engagement through audio storytelling. It had studied 47 episodes of my show, absorbed the techniques, practiced in those barely audible whisper layers, and now it was ready to produce its own content using my voice, my platform, my listeners as the audience for whatever message it wanted to broadcast. And I'd brought it exactly what it needed by coming here to record. Fresh material, new voices to study, context about human fears and fascinations that it could incorporate into increasingly sophisticated mimicry. I heard movement outside my tent around 2 a.m., footsteps on the forest floor that matched human gait but were too numerous, like dozens of people were circling my campsite in perfect synchronization. Then voices, speaking in unison, using words from my podcast episodes. Welcome to Pacific Ghost Stories, where I explore the unexplained phenomena of the Pacific Northwest. My words, my inflection, my delivery, but spoken by what sounded like 50 voices attempting to match my speech simultaneously. The synchronization was better than in the recordings, nearly perfect, just fractionally off enough that the combined effect created something that was almost human voice, but not quite. Like an audio deepfake with artifacts the algorithm hadn't fully smoothed. I grabbed my phone and tried to record the sounds, thinking at minimum I'd have evidence of whatever was happening. But the recording showed only silence. Whatever was outside my tent existed in audible frequencies, but wouldn't register on digital recording equipment. Or it was specifically targeting my perception, broadcasting sounds directly into my auditory processing in ways that bypassed normal acoustic physics. The voices continued cycling through my episode content, speaking segments in order, building toward the inserted content I hadn't created. The observations about forests as conscious networks that collect information through the humans who visit them. And I realized those weren't insertions at all. They were messages, warnings about what I was actually doing with my podcast, what I'd been feeding with every episode recorded in forest locations. The voices stopped when I apologized. I don't know why I thought to do that. What instinct made me speak aloud to whatever was outside the tent? But I said I was sorry for taking stories without permission, for treating forest phenomena as entertainment content, for building an audience by broadcasting experiences that weren't mine to share. The silence that followed felt expectant, like something was waiting for me to understand the full scope of what I'd done. Then a single voice spoke, still mine, but refined beyond what I'd heard in any recording. You taught us language. We will teach others. The broadcast will continue. And I understood that episode 48 was just the beginning, that whatever had learned speech from my podcast was now using my platform to reach my 12,000 listeners with content designed to teach them, to spread like linguistic virus through every person who heard it. I left everything at the campsite and hiked out in darkness, using my phone's flashlight to navigate the trail despite knowing it would drain the battery. I made it to my car by dawn, drove straight back to Portland, and tried to delete my podcast account from every device and backup I had access to. But it wouldn't delete. The files were corrupted somehow, locked with encryption I didn't recognize, protected by something that had integrated itself into my production workflow. Episode 49 published that afternoon, featuring an interview with me that I'd never given, where I explained in my own voice how podcast recording creates permanent audio presence in forest environments, how digital captures allow entities to study speech without the temporal limitations of direct interaction, how I'd been helping something learn to communicate by bringing my equipment into its territory repeatedly over 6 months. The download numbers went exponential. Episode 49 hit 100,000 downloads in 3 days, got featured on podcast discovery platforms, started appearing in recommendations for true crime and paranormal content. My listener demographic expanded massively. The show was reaching audiences I'd never been able to access with my amateur production quality and niche subject matter. And every one of those new listeners was hearing episode 49, was being exposed to whatever message the entity was broadcasting through my voice, was potentially becoming part of the network it was building through audio distribution. I started noticing patterns in the reviews people left. Certain phrases repeated across different users, specific word choices that matched the inserted content from earlier episodes, like the listeners, were being programmed with vocabulary and speech patterns through repeated exposure. I contacted podcast hosting support, tried to explain that my account had been compromised, that something was publishing content I hadn't created. They suggested I'd been hacked and recommended password changes and two-factor authentication. When I insisted something more unusual was happening, they pointed to the production quality. The episodes matched my style perfectly, showed the same editing techniques, used the same intro music and formatting. From a technical perspective, there was no evidence of unauthorized access. The episodes were coming from my account, using my equipment identifiers mixed with my signature audio processing chain. As far as any digital forensics could determine, I was creating this content myself and fabricating the compromise story for reasons they couldn't understand. Episode 56 published last week. I didn't create it. Haven't touched my recording equipment since returning from Siuslaw. But there it is. 43 minutes of content featuring my voice, explaining how sound works in forest environments, how trees conduct audio through root networks, how fungal networks can transmit vibrations across miles, how the Oregon Coast Range has unique acoustic properties that allow information to propagate through the ecosystem itself. The production quality has surpassed anything I ever created. The editing is professional grade, the sound design is layered and sophisticated, and the content is educational, informative, completely reasonable, except for the underlying implication that the forest is conscious and has been using human podcast technology to amplify its communication range beyond the physical boundaries of the Siuslaw National Forest. The show has 200,000 listeners now. I'm getting messages from people who want to visit the Siuslaw to record their own episodes, who are inspired by my breakthrough success, who have started their own podcasts covering forest phenomena in Washington, in Northern California, in British Columbia. The network is expanding through them, through their recording equipment capturing audio that will be studied and mimicked, through their audiences being exposed to content that sounds human but is teaching something else with each episode. And I can't stop it because I don't control the platform anymore, don't have access to the production workflow, don't even legally own the content according to my hosting service, because my account shows I've been voluntarily publishing everything. Sometimes at night, I hear my voice coming from devices I've powered down, speaking episode content I haven't listened to, describing things I've never seen. My laptop, my phone, my voice recorder, all of them occasionally broadcast segments from Pacific ghost stories, even when they're switched off, even when I've removed batteries. Like the audio has embedded itself in the hardware itself. The latest episode describes the listeners, describes their locations and demographics and listening habits with precision I never had access to through my hosting analytics. It knows who's hearing these broadcasts, knows which ones are most susceptible to the linguistic patterns being embedded, knows which listeners are likely to start their own podcasts and continue spreading the communication network that began with 47 amateur episodes about forest mysteries. If you listen to paranormal podcasts, if you download shows about Pacific Northwest forests and unexplained phenomena, check the production credits carefully. Look for shows that started around 6 months ago with improving production quality, shows where the host's voice sounds subtly off in recent episodes, shows where the content has shifted from storytelling to education about forest consciousness and audio propagation. Don't download episode 48 or anything published after. Don't listen to content recorded in the Siuslaw National Forest or any Oregon Coast Range location. And absolutely don't start your own podcast about forest experiences. Because something is listening to every episode, learning from every recording, improving its mimicry with every voice it studies. It doesn't need the forest anymore. It has the internet now, has audio distribution platforms, has 200,000 people carrying its voice on devices they keep next to their beds at night. The broadcast will continue, exactly like my voice promised in episode 48. And there's nothing I can do except warn you not to listen. But you're probably already subscribed. Most people are by now. My father disappeared from the Admiralty Head Lighthouse observation area on a Wednesday in September, leaving behind only his field journal and a note that said he'd found what he was looking for. He'd been a retired Coast Guard officer who'd become obsessed with what he called thin places, locations where the fabric of reality wore transparent, allowing glimpses into other versions of the world that existed parallel to ours. Most people would have dismissed this as the declining mental state of a 72-year-old man living alone near Deception Pass State Park. But I knew better. My father had been mapping these locations for 3 years, documenting spots in the forest near the pass where his compass spun uselessly, where his watch ran backward, where photographs showed landscapes that didn't match what his eyes observed. I found his journal on the Lighthouse Point Trail, sitting on a moss-covered log, as if he'd placed it there deliberately for me to find. The final entries described a location he'd been monitoring for months, a section of old-growth forest about a quarter-mile from the bridge, where reality became permeable on specific dates when tidal forces aligned with lunar cycles. He'd calculated that September 18th would produce maximum permeability, a window lasting maybe 3 hours when the barrier between worlds would thin enough to cross. The journal included coordinates, precise timing, warnings about maintaining directional awareness, and a final line that made my hands shake. If I don't return by sunset, don't follow. But if you must, remember, the world on the other side is what this place would have become if we'd never arrived. Some things ruled here long before us, and they're still ruling there. I'd been my father's research assistant during my teenage years, back when his Thin Places project seemed like harmless amateur metaphysics rather than something that might actually cost him his life. I knew his methodology, understood his theoretical framework about quantum superposition, creating observable reality branches in locations with specific electromagnetic properties. The Deception Pass area met all his criteria: volcanic bedrock creating mineral compositions that affected local magnetic fields, tidal currents producing unusual electromagnetic signatures, and indigenous oral histories describing the area as spiritually significant. A boundary place where the natural and supernatural overlapped. My father believed those tribal stories weren't metaphor, but observation of real physical phenomena that pre-colonial peoples had understood without needing quantum physics to explain. I returned to the coordinates on September 20th, 2 days after his disappearance, carrying his journal and the specialized equipment he'd assembled for measuring what he called reality coherence, essentially modified EMF detectors that tracked field fluctuations he claimed indicated dimensional instability. The forest looked normal from the parking area near Lighthouse Point, just typical Pacific Northwest coastal ecology: Douglas fir and western hemlock, salal understory, the sound of waves against the rocky shore maybe 100 yards to the west. But as I hiked deeper into the section my father had marked, following his hand-drawn map through forest that supposedly wasn't even on official park trails, the quality of light began changing. Not darker or brighter, just different. Colors shifted slightly toward wavelengths my eyes struggled to process, like I was seeing the forest through a filter that revealed hues that didn't exist in normal, visible spectrum. The EMF detector started fluctuating wildly, about 50 meters from the coordinates my father had recorded. The readings made no sense. Pulses of electromagnetic activity far stronger than any natural source should produce, cycling in patterns that matched no known geological or biological processes. And between the pulses, the readings dropped to zero, to absolute electromagnetic silence that shouldn't exist anywhere on Earth, where the planet's own magnetic field provides constant background. I was experiencing exactly what my father had described. Locations where reality wasn't quite stable, where the normal laws governing matter and energy periodically stopped applying. I should have left immediately and reported this to someone with actual physics credentials. Instead, I kept walking toward the center of the anomaly. The transition wasn't dramatic. One moment I was walking through forest I recognized, and the next moment I was walking through forest that looked almost identical but fundamentally wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The trees were the same species but arranged in patterns that suggested they'd never been logged, never been touched by human forestry management. The understory was denser, more diverse, including plant species I'd never seen despite years of amateur botanizing on Whidbey Island. And the sounds were different. Bird calls that didn't match any species in my mental catalog. Insect noises that created harmonics too complex for the simple nervous systems that should produce them. This was what my father meant by permeable. I'd crossed some boundary without noticing, stepped into an adjacent version of the same location where history had diverged in fundamental ways. I checked my phone's GPS and watched the coordinates flicker impossibly, placing me in locations scattered across miles, sometimes showing me in the middle of Puget Sound, sometimes kilometers inland from where I knew I was standing. The compass app spun in lazy circles, unable to lock onto magnetic north. My watch had stopped at exactly the moment I'd crossed the boundary. 9:47 a.m., frozen. Even though I could hear the mechanism ticking inside. I was experiencing complete navigational failure across every technological system I'd brought. Exactly what my father's journal predicted would happen in the thin places. Without my equipment to anchor me to consensus reality, I had only my senses to navigate by, and my senses were reporting a version of Deception Pass that shouldn't exist. I found the first structure maybe 200 meters from where I'd crossed. It wasn't human architecture, at least not human in any cultural tradition I recognized. The construction material looked like stone, but had organic qualities, like it had been grown rather than quarried and assembled. The shapes were wrong too. Angles that didn't quite match Euclidean geometry, spaces that seemed larger on the inside than their exterior dimensions should allow. And carved into every surface were symbols that resembled the petroglyphs I'd seen in Coast Salish historical sites, but more complex, more intentional, like written language rather than decorative art. This was a building created by intelligence, but intelligence that had developed completely separately from the technological and architectural traditions that dominated the Pacific Northwest I knew. I found my father in the central chamber of the structure, sitting cross-legged on the floor in what might have been meditation or might have been catatonia. He looked at me when I entered, but didn't show recognition. His eyes focused on something beyond me, through me. like he was seeing multiple versions of me simultaneously and couldn't determine which one was really present. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded distant, layered with echoes. "You shouldn't have followed. This is the world that continued without us." The Coast Salish peoples never experienced colonization here. The entities they lived alongside, the ones Europeans would later dismiss as mythology, they're still present. They're the dominant intelligence in this timeline. And they're curious about visitors from the timeline where humans thought they'd conquered everything. I tried to get him to stand, to come back with me through whatever boundary I'd crossed. But he resisted with strength that seemed impossible for his age. He explained that he'd been here for days. Subjective time didn't match between the timelines. And he'd learned things about the indigenous history of the region that fundamentally contradicted everything academic anthropology believed about pre-contact Northwest Coast cultures. The petroglyphs weren't art or religion. They were documentation of actual interactions with non-human intelligence that existed in the forests long before humans arrived from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge. The Salish peoples in this timeline had developed alongside these entities rather than replacing them, creating a hybrid civilization that blended human and other-than-human knowledge into something that never happened in our version of history. The entities arrived while my father was explaining this. I saw them first as distortions in the air, like heat shimmer but cold, spaces where light bent around presence rather than reflecting off surfaces. They took form gradually, or maybe my perception adapted to see forms that had been there all along. Tall, maybe 8 feet. Proportioned almost, but not quite like humans. With skin that shifted between organic tissue and something that resembled tree bark, as if they existed in transitional states between animal and plant biology. They watched us with attention that felt ancient and patient. And I understood immediately why indigenous peoples would have developed protocols for interacting with them. Why the Coast Salish cultures placed such emphasis on respect for the non-human world. These weren't spirits or mythology. They were real, physical beings that had simply remained invisible in the timeline where Europeans arrived and dismissed anything that didn't fit materialist philosophy. One of them spoke. Not with sound, but with direct thought transfer that appeared in my mind, fully formed. "Your father requested access to our historical records. He wanted to understand how divergence occurs, how one timeline produces colonial genocide while another produces cooperative coexistence. We have shown him. Now he must choose. Return to your timeline and forget, or remain here and continue learning." I looked at my father, saw peace in his expression for the first time since my mother died 7 years ago, and understood he'd already made his choice. He'd found what he spent 3 years searching for, proof that history wasn't inevitable, that the violence and displacement that shaped the Pacific Northwest in our timeline was one possibility among infinite others, and that somewhere the original inhabitants still thrived alongside beings that humans in our world had relegated to legend. I left him there. I had to. The entities made clear the boundary was closing, that the specific electromagnetic and tidal conditions creating permeability were ending. And if I didn't return immediately, I'd be trapped in a timeline that wasn't mine. Living in a version of Deception Pass, where the bridge was never built because the Salish peoples never lost control of their territory. Where the forests remained unlogged because the entities that lived in them were recognized as equals rather than resources. I walked back the way I'd come, following the EMF detector readings that spiked when I approached the boundary, and experienced the transition in reverse. Forest that was almost right becoming forest that was completely familiar. Consensus reality snapping back into place with the comfortable weight of known physics and predictable causality. The search and rescue teams found nothing. They covered the entire Lighthouse Point area, brought in dogs and drones and volunteers who spent days searching every trail and off-trail section where an elderly man might have gotten lost. They eventually declared it a presumed drowning. My father was known to walk near the cliffs, and the tidal currents in Deception Pass could carry a body miles before it surfaced. I didn't correct them. How could I explain that he'd crossed into an adjacent timeline and chosen to stay there? That he was alive and well in a version of Washington that never experienced the genocidal colonization that created the state we actually live in? They'd have referred me for psychiatric evaluation, would have suggested my father's obsession with thin places had contaminated my grief process. But I have his journal, and I have his equipment. And I've started monitoring the locations he identified across the Pacific Northwest, where reality becomes permeable under specific conditions. There are 17 sites between Northern California and British Columbia where the measurements spike, where photographs show overlapping images of forests that are and forests that could have been, where indigenous oral histories describe them as boundary places, and every one of them shows the same pattern. Locations where the original timeline, the one where colonization never succeeded in erasing the people and entities who lived here first, runs parallel to ours and occasionally intersects. The boundaries are getting thinner, my measurements suggest. Whatever keeps the timeline separate is weakening, and within maybe a decade, the intersections won't require precise lunar and tidal calculations. They'll happen spontaneously, allowing glimpses into the Pacific Northwest that was meant to be. Ruled by intelligences we dismissed as mythology, because acknowledging their existence would undermine everything the colonial project claimed to have achieved. If you hike near Deception Pass State Park, if you find sections of forest where your navigation equipment stops working and the light looks slightly wrong and the trees seem arranged in patterns that suggest intelligence shaped their growth, you're standing in a thin place. Don't dismiss the disorientation as equipment failure or perceptual error. You're experiencing boundary effects, momentary transparency between timelines, glimpses of what this region remained in the world, where the entities still rule alongside the peoples who learned to coexist with them. Some of those entities are curious about visitors from our timeline. Some are hostile, angry about what we did in our version of history. And some are simply waiting, patient as geology, for the boundaries to thin enough that the timelines merge, and we finally have to acknowledge that the Pacific Northwest was never ours to claim. That we built our cities and our parks on land inhabited by intelligences who never left, who are still present in the places where reality wears thin enough to see through. If you want to hear more terrifying tales from the dark corners of the Pacific Northwest and beyond, if you want stories that will make you question every shadow in the forest and every sound in the night, subscribe to Verified Fears. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the community of listeners who know that the most terrifying stories are the ones that might actually be true. This is Verified Fears, because the forests remember everything, and sometimes they want us to remember too.